911 operators of Reddit. What call will you simply never forget? Hey guys, a quick content warning for this one. In this thread, there are multiple mentions of SA, child abuse, child endangerment, stuff like that. If for any reason you don't want to hear about any of that, it's all good. Here's your warning to click off the video. That being said, here we go. During a power outage, I got screamed at by a man who demanded to know why he didn't have power when a car just drove by with its lights on. I hate my job. Not gonna lie, when I read the title of this thread, I was bracing for impact. We started with, not what I expected, but I have a feeling the worst is yet to come. Story 2. Older lady, I want to say maybe early 70s, calls in with a sort of polite urgency in her voice. Tells me she thinks she's having a stroke. Tells me she has her grandchild at the house with her. Asks me to call her daughter to come get the child. By the time she's done giving me the phone number, there's a very slight slur in her speech. By the time EMS got there, probably no more than 5 minutes or so, I couldn't understand a thing she was saying. Fascinating, disturbing, and profoundly sad hearing someone stroke out on the phone as they're talking to you. Story 3. Not me, but an old roommate of mine told me the story. When she was an operator about 3 years ago, a boy about 5 or 6 called 911 and said, "Daddy's holding a pew-pew to mommy's head." Through the phone, she could hear the father screaming at his wife and threatening to off the kid. My roommate told the kid to go hide and had to talk him through it, even when she heard shots. When the police and ambulances arrived, the mom had been fatally shot, but they were able to save the kid before the dad got to him. Story 4. I took a call from a woman who told me her 15-year-old nephew had locked himself in the garage during a family gathering after making statements seeming like he wanted to take his own life. I stayed on the line with her until my deputies could get on scene. Before they got there, however, the family was able to gain entry to the garage, only to find him hanging by the neck from the garage door opener while burning. Apparently he had doused himself with gasoline or some sort of accelerant, lit himself on fire, and then dropped with the rope. I'll never forget the screams of horror from the caller and the rest of the family in the background when they saw him, as well as the cracks in my sergeant's voice as he yelled for more units over the radio as the family started mobbing them when they arrived on scene. Story 5. I've been a 911 dispatcher for 11 years in a medium-sized center, population 180,000. We have more than our share of crazy calls, but there are only a few that have stuck with me. For me, the ones I can't get rid of aren't even close to being the craziest or most brutal. 7 to 8 years ago, I took a call from a man who came home to find his adult sister had been attacked and beaten. The suspect had wrapped a telephone cord around her neck, then tried to push her through the window of the apartment. He was understandably very distraught. She was still alive and was able to talk to me. She had not been blindfolded, and I was certain I could get a description of the person who had done this to her. She answered all of my other questions, but absolutely refused to give me any info on the suspect. I later found out the reason was self-preservation. The person who did it was the brother who called for help. He was so believable it really messed with my head. I also felt horrible that I'd continued pressing her for info with the person who hurt her being right there, and that I potentially could have put her in more danger without realizing. Story 6. I worked for a dispatch company very similar to Life Alert. An older lady in her 80s thought someone was intruding on her property and called the cops. She had severe dementia, though, and forgot she had called the cops. So when they rang her door, she thought they were the intruders. So she hit her wrist button to get in contact with us, then got out her weapon. I then called the police while also talking to her, and literally on the recording, you could hear her taking shots at the police officers on scene, while they freaked out, while I, and my supervisor, tried to talk her down. The police and I eventually got her to calm down and stop firing, but apparently she had missed a police officer by just 6 inches. Family had to get involved, and she ended up moving to a nursing home shortly after. Dementia sucks. Story 7. I'm sure plenty of other people will have crazier ones, but the first time I took an overdose call, it's a crazy experience, literally hearing someone dying on the other side of the phone. It was sort of a mix of gurgling, screaming, and gasping for air. Fortunately, the friend of the person that was ODing was the one who called, so I could actually get some information and pass along to my officers/firefighters. Unfortunately, the caller was also super high and freaking out, understandably, and decided to lie about what drugs his friend was on, which slightly delayed a Narcan being administered. Not to the point that it mattered, but it did delay it. The person lived, though. Story 8. I used to volunteer for a hotline for people who wanted to take their own lives, and I'll always remember my first active attempt. Usually the people we had call were in the planning stages, but occasionally, usually in the early hours of the morning, you'd get someone in the process of. There was nothing frantic about it. It was eerily matter of fact. The person had already taken the overdose, and they were ringing because they wanted to talk to someone as they passed. It's honestly the most powerless I've ever felt, and none of my training truly prepared me for it. As we're a national talking line, we aren't allowed to actively talk people out of doing it, i.e., you can't tell people don't do it. We also can't phone an ambulance as the person in question could be anywhere in the country. I asked if this person would consider calling themselves an ambulance, but they declined. I was only 23 at the time and have suffered from severe depression myself, and attempted to take my life a few years before, so I know firsthand what it's like to be in that situation. Being on the other side of it was hard, but I really just hope that I provided that person with comfort towards the end. Edit. I've had a lot of comments asking why we can't actively try to stop people attempting it. I've answered in more detail below, but in short, our remit was always as a talking/listening service. Trying to convince someone not to do it is often counterproductive. Ultimately, taking one's own life is that person's choice and theirs alone. We could provide a space for them to talk about how they felt without judgment or opinion, and it very often gave them a chance to reflect on their options, and it has helped a great many people. While I think for the most part I do understand the whole you can't tell people not to do it thing, just from a psychological standpoint and like what's best for the person, if that isn't just the hardest thing though on the person taking the call, because like that's all you would want to say in that moment, right? I'm sorry, OP. That's a rough gig. And although you do important work, I'm sure the hard times are still just as hard. Story 9. For me, the worst ones are always the calls you can relate to on a personal level. I took a call last month from a father who discovered his son with a bag over his head and a note next to his body. I've taken a ton of calls of people taking their own lives, but this one was particularly difficult for me because the son was my age, and the way the father pleaded with his son was almost exactly the same way I've imagined my dad if I were to ever do the same. I've had the same "come on buddy, don't do this to me" running in my head at least 2 to 3 times a day since. Also not technically a call, but my first shift on my own, I dispatched the deputy I did my ride along with to a domestic that he ended up being shot and offed at. Hearing his blood-gurgled, shots fired scream on the radio won't be something I'll ever forget. Story 10. I've been doing this more than a decade and have taken some absolutely nutty calls. The one that stands out is not, but it stays with me. I took a 911 from a woman who asked me for an ambulance. Dead voice, no emotion. She could have been calling the bank for their hours. I got and confirmed her address, again very calm. Then I asked her what was going on. In that same lifeless voice, she said, "My son is dead." No change in her tone whatsoever. I asked her if she was sure. Asked her to start CPR, which she flatly refused. I asked her, please, let's at least try CPR, and she just said, "He is cold and dead, and it's my fault. My fault. My fault." Her tone never changed. Turns out she had caught her 15-year-old son doing hoaxes. He puked at some point. She was totally clueless and just sent his butt to bed. Sometime during the night, he took either more, or what he had taken caused him to vomit again, and he choked. I'll never forget that dead tone she had, because in a way, she was right. Her ignorance did contribute to his passing, but she's not even partially to blame. Try telling her that, though. That woman will never stop hating herself. I feel for her to this day, and that was 2009-ish. Story 11. Used to take ambulance calls for 999 over here in the UK and thought I would add a happier call here to buck the trend. I managed to deliver 5 babies while doing that job. The first one the dad was on. First thing he screams was, "The head is coming out, the head's coming out." Another one, they were on their way to the hospital when the baby just started arriving. So I delivered a baby over the phone on the side of a motorway. The sound of a baby crying during childbirth is the most stress-relieving sound of all. One of the families wrote in to say thank you, and I got to meet them and the baby. On the flip side, hangings were never fun. Thankfully, I only ever had 2. The first was a Tuesday morning. Just started my shift at 7 a.m. first call. Woman comes on screaming this blood-curdling noise, just pure emotion, nothing like in the films. Turns out her husband had hung himself in their bedroom with the kids still in the house, so she was trying to keep the kids out while getting an ambulance. The other was a man who called ever so calmly to say his daughter had hung herself. I didn't understand why he was so calm and measured. Then at the end he said he was a police officer, so he'd seen it before. Poor guy. I still think about those 2 callers. Story 12. A young man 23 years old called and told me he was going to take his own life. He was my first call of my shift that day very early in the morning. He planned to set his car on fire with himself inside. He was upset and crying, but he apologized to me. He said he was sorry I picked up the phone, and he was sorry for how this was going to affect me. He hung up on me, and the second time I was speaking to him, I could hear liquid splashing in the background. He ended up hanging up again, and I never got him back. He did end up setting the fire, and he was fully engulfed by the time anyone got there. I'll never forget his name or voice, and I simply hope I showed him kindness and compassion in his last moments. Story 13. My brother-in-law is a 999 operator in the UK. They also take calls on the non-emergency number, which is 101. He tells me about the more lighthearted calls, and one of them always makes me smile when I remember it. Call comes through on 101, and all he can hear is some faint muttering and a TV in the background. He's a bit worried because it's potentially someone who has collapsed, managed to dial a number, but isn't able to talk. He's trying to get a response when suddenly an old guy starts talking to him, obviously very confused as to why there's someone on the end of the phone. Turns out the old guy had thought his phone was his TV remote, and he was just trying to watch the golf on BBC, which happens to be channel 101. He was very apologetic when my brother-in-law explained what he'd done. You know when you sometimes get a text from someone and they thought it was Google, so it's just a random question? This sort of feels like an older school version of that, you know? It's like, nope, not quite right, but close, I guess. Anyway, the lighter posts are much appreciated. Thank you, OP. Story 14. 112 from Europe, hope it counts. Woman called that her father sent her text that he's going to off himself by jumping under a train. That wasn't too bad for me. Things like that happen every now and then. The scary part was the way she said in about half an hour there's a train going through our village. She tried very hard not to cry while talking to me, but this was the part she broke down, as if she realized they have less than half an hour to find him, or he's dead. The man was found in a train station drunk and depressed, sitting on a bench. My friend had a call from a guy that was crushed by collapsed scaffolding. He was talking to him the whole time until he passed before the ambulance came. The operator's a tough guy, ex-cop, but I've never seen him that broken before. We only got to know what happened like a week later. And the funny ones. Yesterday I had a call from the Queen of Hamsters, who complained that hackers cut her internet connection because she doesn't like one of our politicians. Story 15. There are a few I'll remember for a long time. One was a guy who was riding his bike who saw a father running after his grown-up son. He was yelling, "Stop him, he wants to hurt himself. He wants to jump in front of a train." When the guy was calling, he was running after the two near the train tracks. I quickly sent their location to dispatch and stayed on the phone. The guy asked if he could tackle the son if he had the chance to, so I told him he could do what deemed fit, but should always think of his own safety. However, he then started yelling. The train was there, as I could hear it in the background. He started cussing and screaming, and I immediately knew the son had, in fact, jumped in front of the train, passing instantly. It was horrible for everyone involved. The guy immediately started blaming himself for not being able to stop it. After all that, I took a short break outside and then continued work with less empathy for people calling for whatever their neighbor did. Story 16. Not me, but my mother's been a 911 operator for the past 15 years or so, and I'm sure me and my siblings have heard about this one call on multiple occasions when we were younger. A teenage girl/young woman had been kidnapped. The good old bait and switch of an older woman buying her drinks at a bar, etc., friendly older type who'd bend the rules, ends up drugging her and handing her off to this guy who takes her back to his basement and essays her. So trapped in a basement with a guy with a knife, he had fallen asleep, and the girl manages to find/get a phone and call 911. My mother answers and essentially walks this girl through getting help, from peeking out the basement windows and trying to find a street sign or whatever. It comes down to my mother and a few other dispatchers carting around police cars blaring their lights in a general area until the girl could see them and the officers could find her exact location. Safe and sound. After that, my mother got recognized for her work, and she got a piece of paper commemorating the excellent effort. So the adult version of an honor roll. Edit. I texted her about the story and have the full incident in detail. Mom got the call at 6 a.m. and thought it was a prank call at first. Victim, 15 years old. The story goes the girl was with female friend Rosa, 21, and the offender, sharing a bottle and saying they would give her a ride home. Woke up to the essay, and the man stuck the knife in the wall threateningly. He said he would offer if she tried to leave. He had taken her clothes as well. Mom convinced the girl to take the knife and try breaking the lock at the top of the stairs, so her and her supervisor began multitasking. You get a 2-block radius off of cell phones when in use. And so they sent squad cars up and down the blocks, and the girl luckily remembered the car he drove, so they were looking for a small 2-door blue car he left parked in an alley. My mom suggested the girl break the basement window and make a run for it, but he had those blocked glass windows, so that wouldn't work. All of this was done by whisper as the offender was in the room for half an hour to an hour. They also sent police to her grandmother's to see if they could find the address of the Rosa friend, which they did, but the friend was no help in getting the offender's address. They did the whole blaring lights method, and the girl managed to get out through the basement's back door and went running in the offender's shorts. Considering the location, it was like some sort of coach house property, and they would never have found her without the miraculous turn of events. My mother and the cop who was first response on the scene were both awarded. My mom's quote on the job, "I hear too much, but it just makes you more aware of the evil around us." Story 17. I've been a police dispatcher for a little over 2 years. The call I'll never forget is the first call about someone taking their own life I got. It was around 11:30 p.m., and this girl calls a 911. She must have been 19 to 20 years old. All she says is that she's just calling to let me know where to find her body. I ask her where she's at, an address, intersection, anything. She tells me she's old enough to know that I already have her location, so she doesn't need to give it to me. That's not true. All I have is the location of the cell tower her cell phone is pinging off of. No way I can find her. I plead with her a bit and she finally gives me an address. Then I ask her how she's planning to do it. I'm trying to keep her on the line as long as possible so she doesn't actually hurt herself, but she doesn't answer me anymore. I decide to get the paramedics on the line so we can get police and fire rolling to her location. While I'm connecting to the fire department, I hear this crash and a choking sound. I don't know what she did, but my heart drops. I'm thinking she offed herself with me on the line. I give the address to FD and I have PD on the way. I'm listening on the radio while I'm trying to get this girl to talk to me again when I hear the officers ask to verify the address. They don't see a house there. Dang it. I finally get this girl to come back on the phone and she's crying hysterically. I ask her what happened, and she tells me she was in the bathroom and tried to hang herself. She was too heavy and the shower curtain bar bent. I'm a bit relieved because she's not dead, but she is still in danger. I asked her to give me the address again, and even though she's on the same street, her address is further south. Crap, I forget the officers and EMS that are closer to go. I start talking to her and so far so good. Officers get there, but they can't find her. I'm freaking out again because I'm thinking she gave me the wrong address. And she stops talking to me. Just an open line. I don't know what to do. Silence. I attempt hanging up and calling her, but no answer. I'm thinking I screwed up. I ask my supervisor if there's anything else I can do, and they reassure me and tell me I did all I could. I listen to the police radio for a bit and hear that the officers managed to get into the house and found the girl. She was being transported to the hospital. It was a huge weight off my shoulders. I took a break for a few minutes to collect my thoughts and went back to answering more calls. We were busy. I can't imagine you would easily forget a call like that, especially it being your first. From what it sounds like, OP, you did incredibly, and you very well could have saved this young woman's life. I hope she's found peace in her mental struggles, and at the very least she has the chance to because of your work, OP. Wishing all the best for both of you. Story 19. I've left the job now for pastures anew, but story time. Woman of 90 years old calls up and says she's having a spot of trouble. She's struggling to work the phone and tells me she's basically had a leg ulcer which has popped, and that she's on blood thinners, so there's a lot of blood coming out. I get an ambulance out immediately to her, but midway through the call it goes silent, and I hear a big ol' thud on the floor. After this, I try my best to basically shout down the phone after her to get her attention. All I can hear is very heavy breathing, but no reply. This continues for a couple of minutes before I hear banging on the other side of the line and a voice faintly shouting the lady's name. I keep trying to rouse her myself, but I'm unsuccessful. I hear the window break and a couple of voices approaching. They reach her, and thankfully I hear her very faint voice respond. Normally we don't find out what happens, but in this case, I actually received a letter and chocolates from the lady who sent it in, and said that she could hear me the whole time and felt reassured that help was coming, but she just didn't have the strength to reply. For what was a really, really crappy job at the time, getting that made the next few months really easy. Story 20. Can't really think of the one that stands out the most, but just off the top of my head, here's two. Guy who calls sounds severely short of breath, can barely give out his address, which happens from time to time. Tell me exactly what happened. And he says, I'm having trouble breathing. Okay, I send the maximum response. Stay on the line while I'm waiting for crews to arrive. The guy drops the phone. I keep trying to get him to pick it back up with no success. Crew gets there, ask for police right away. Turns out the guy got stabbed in the chest. Yeah, that'll mess up your breathing, I guess. Tried their best, but couldn't get him back. Called it on scene. Second one. Tell me exactly what happened. A guy was changing a truck tire and it exploded. He's inside a wall now. Sorry, he's what now? He's embedded in the wall. Slight pause on my end. Is he awake? No. Is he breathing? No. Okay, I'm going to teach you how to do CPR so we can help him. I don't think you understand. He's flattened halfway inside the wall. I don't think we can help him. Okay, we're on the way. Crew got there, and sure enough, he was pretty dead. Edit. Sorry if any of this came across as insensitive. It's just the way that most first responders and dispatchers will talk, like it's more academic at this point than anything. Unfortunately, the truth is, most people have a limited amount of empathy to give. If you cared and thought about every single call, that's how you get PTSD. You need to be selective about the calls that you really care about. For me, it's mostly kid calls, but that's a story for another day. Story 21. This one still bothers me because it's so fresh. and our community is hurting from it as well. Took a call from a hysterical woman advising me of a rollover crash that happened near her house. She lives near the top of a blind hill that people like to jump, like catching that butterfly feeling in your stomach, although you can get air in the right vehicle. She tells me the girl is laying on the ground about 30 feet or so from the vehicle. When asked if the girl is alive, she says, "Oh yes, honey, she's wiggling around on the ground. My daughter is a nurse. She's checking on her now." Awesome. We're hardly ever lucky enough to have a trained professional on scene before a med unit can get there. But then she tells me her daughter's starting CPR. To be honest, that didn't surprise me. My caller was getting hysterical again, and we already had first responders on the way, so I start asking more questions about the scene. Her daughter breaks CPR to get on the phone with me, tells me she can only do compressions, and that the girl's jaw is completely gone. A bit stunned, I tell her to continue compressions, but rather than getting put back on with the original caller, I hear the scared voice of a teenage girl, the driver. Is my friend going to be okay? I can't find anything to say for a moment. Finally, after what seemed to be too long, I say, "They're doing CPR, dear, and we have help on the way. Are you and the other passenger okay?" "We're fine. Just please tell me she's okay." The girl on the ground was confirmed DOA. She had been laying down in the back seat without her seatbelt on because she had a headache. She was 15. Story 22. I've been a 911 operator for 10 years. I'll never forget the time I took a noise complaint. The caller was complaining that the children in the street were being too loud. Happens all the time. Annoying, but no big deal. The odd thing was, she was calling me through a relay service for the deaf. And another call. We were working a barricaded subject call with SWAT. Called out the helicopter and had them circling the area for what seemed like hours. This usually leads to calls of citizens concerned that we're looking for someone and want to know if it's safe. So after constantly answering the phones and telling people it's fine, I get a phone call from a girl. She asked about the helicopter. I gave her the basic rundown and then she goes, "Oh, okay, so the helicopter isn't in danger?" She thought it was crashing and had been for hours. Of course, we get bad calls, but I try not to focus on those. Edited to add. I realized there are several reasons someone who may have hearing would use a relay service. This was a younger female who was actually deaf, although I'm not sure to what extent. We had a history of her calling and knew who she was based off address and phone number. She was just grumpy and mad the kids were playing outside. Story 23. This actually happened a few days ago. I'm an ER tech, but one of our unit secretaries, someone who transfers calls and does other important tasks that keeps the place afloat, is an EMT in the next county over. I was waiting for a patient to return to their room, talking with her, when she looks down at her phone. She tells me she has the dispatch app or whatever for ambulances and fire trucks, and every fire hall in the county just received a call about a possible decomposing body. Apparently, the neighbor called about a terrible smell coming from the property. Hazmat was called and everything, expecting a dead human body. Once they broke into the house, they found it wasn't a dead human, but 38 dogs. 11 of the dogs were dead and in varying states of decomposition. The place is still pretty much under wraps, but 16 more dogs were found in the shed yesterday. The 2 people who owned the house have been since arrested and charged with 51 counts of animal cruelty. All of the animals left alive were taken to the Humane Society, where half the county has just about donated food or blankets. The whole thing is pretty messed up, but I now for sure respect the hell out of EMTs and paramedics that walk through our doors every day. They really never know what they're going to see when they walk into a place. Story 24. Let me preface this by stating I was the shift supervisor at the time and was only supposed to answer overflow calls, as it was my responsibility to make sure the other 14 dispatchers/call takers were doing their job. I take an overflow call on July 4th around 9 p.m., figuring it was another fireworks complaint or something easy, as that's what most calls are on July 4th. I speak with an elderly lady who tells me her house is on fire and she is trapped on the 3rd floor. So already my heart is in my throat trying to remain calm. Also, I can try and calm this person down as much as possible. This is where having a wonderful partner really came in handy. My partner, who is the other shift supervisor, instantly took control over the dispatch operations. Once the rest of the room caught wind I was on a hot call, they quieted down so my partner and I could communicate. In the meantime, while he's getting the fire service dispatched, I'm doing everything in my power to make sure the lady keeps talking to me. I ascertained as many details about the room and how to get there as I could. Had to try to open the window because at this point the room was filling with smoke. The few minutes it took the fire department to get there felt like an eternity. It really felt like time stopped. Once the fire department arrived, they pull up and find the house is only 2 stories tall, even though the lady said she was on the 3rd floor. Here it turns out street level is only 2 stories, but looking at the back of the house, it's 3 stories due to the slope. As the fire department begins making entry, the woman collapses. So at this point, I'm not sure if she was going to make it. After a few seconds of not hearing from her, I could finally hear the firefighters' SCBA. A little bit of relief. Something happens in my brain though. I'm not sure if it was because I was scared for the woman maybe not making it. Maybe I was scared for the firefighters, and being a firefighter for 13 years, I could be in their position at any point. But while I was on the phone, I broke down in tears. In the 8 years of doing 911, this was the call that broke me mentally. The firefighters were able to rescue her. She lived, and is still living despite 70% third-degree burns. As successful as the outcome was, it messed with my brain for a while. I've dealt with a lot in my time, but this was the one that got to me. I continued to do 911 for a few months after that, but I'm not sure if it was depression or PTSD or some other kind of issue. I ended up resigning. It was to the point when I was home, I really wasn't home. It was affecting my relationship. Only recently have I made appointments to go get professional help. For any other emergency responders, or anyone for that matter, thank you for all you do. But seriously, if you're not feeling okay, get some help. It's not something to keep putting off. Story 25. Not me, but our fire department captain works as a 911 operator in our country. Had a call 2 months ago. It was someone's daughter calling. She was calm as nothing had happened, and described exactly what had happened. Basically, she ended her mother while they were arguing. No remorse, sadness, or anything. She told him that she probably ended her mother because she choked her too much, and the poor old lady stopped breathing. Cops and ambulance went to the house, and she was waiting for them like nothing happened. If I remember correctly, daughter got 7 or 8 years in jail. Edit. Got one more from a family member who is a cop. They went on a call for a possible death in the apartment, so firefighters were also called. Address was actually a block of flats, and they saw one wide open door on the floor where victim should be living. Lo and behold, when they entered the apartment, there was a man hanging from the ceiling. He set up a tripod on the table and live streamed everything on Facebook. Some family members arrived shortly after police, and they confirmed that the video was indeed live. Story 26. My aunt is a dispatcher for a small county in Arkansas. She got a call one night from a woman who was hiding in the bedroom closet. Apparently, these 2 men broke into her house and were rummaging through her belongings. She told my aunt that she had a weapon, and if they made it up the stairs, she was going to go out and shoot them. My aunt tried to calm her down, telling her police were only about a minute away. No sooner than that did the lady say, "Oh my God, here they come." The phone dropped, and then 6 shots followed afterwards. The lady picked up the phone, now in a panic, screaming and yelling. Thankfully, police got there not long after. Lady never got charged with anything. One of the suspects passed. The other one survived. Story 27. I once took a call from a hysterical woman. Her car had been broken into whilst parked in a car park. Offenders stole her handbag and everything inside. She was so distraught, unable to put 2 words together. The very next call I took was from a guy who had just got home after work after picking his 2 kids up from daycare. He found his wife dead on the couch, possibly from taking her own life. He was so calm and composed, like it wasn't even an issue for him. I'm sure he was this way because of shock, though. The way each person reacted in each call stuck with me. Both of these incidents were on different ends of the spectrum as far as life-changing events, yet the responses each caller had to each event were not what I would have expected at all. But everyone that genuinely calls a 911, or in my case 000, is having a really bad day. Story 28. I've been dispatching for a combined center that services 8 rural counties for 2 years, and in that time I've had about half a dozen calls that I'll carry to the grave. That said, my most memorable was about a month after I got signed off, on a Saturday night from one of our BFE counties. This old southern AA grandma and her family had just arrived home from a dinner out in the city, and found a box standing in front of their door, connected to the doorknob by electrical cords, and it's ticking. I, in my noobishness, did not have all our 10 codes memorized at the time, so after I've gotten all her information and gotten to the call type, I pick up my cheat sheet trying to figure out how to code a possible bomb. It's a 1089 for future reference. As I'm scanning my code sheet, Grandma pipes back up. "It's okay, they're gonna kick it off the porch." This doesn't register for a second, and the first words out of my mouth are, "Wait, what?" Followed almost immediately by, "No, no, 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 no." "Oh, it's okay, it was just some electrical cords." I'm extra grateful they didn't get blown up, because I would have sounded real dumb on national news with, "Wait, what?" So I haven't been doing voices because it's more of a serious thread for the most part. But I figured that if there were ever a time, this one's not too bad for it. How did that box get there? And also, what do you mean they're going to kick it off the porch? That's insanity. Those people have nerves of steel. And although generally a bad idea, I do kind of have to respect the fearlessness. Story 29. I have a few. I took a call from a man whose 1-ish-year-old daughter fell in the pool while unattended. At the time of the call, she wasn't breathing, unresponsive, and had no pulse. My partner dispatched out fire and EMS while I was on the phone. Got the child's mother to start CPR. Fortunately, she was certified and didn't require very much instruction at all. Just had to tell her to count her compressions out loud so I could keep up. Before first responders arrived, the baby started breathing again. I believe she sustained some brain injury, but nothing life-threatening. Had to take a walk around the block after that one. Please, 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 if you aren't CPR certified, get certified. It may very well have been the difference between that child living or dying. On a lighter note, I had a guy call in claiming he was having a heart attack. None of the info I got from this guy indicated he was even remotely at risk. Mid-20s, male, average weight, no history of heart problems, or any other medical history for that matter. Turns out he had smoked some particularly strong pot about 30 minutes prior to calling. Absolutely nothing wrong with him other than he was stoned stupid. We got a pretty good laugh out of that one. I also took a call from a kid who was about 10 years old who thought it would be funny to prank call 911. He started off saying there was a fire and I could hear him giggling in the background. Followed that up with meowing at me over the phone. Managed to get a good location off the call and got his address. Read the address to him and asked if that's where he lives. Click. Alright, gotcha now, you little crap. Had a deputy go out to the house, as is our policy, and he explained the situation to the parents. Deputy told me later the kid got the butt chewing of a lifetime. Super gratifying. I agree. OP. Definitely satisfying. But can we call it anything other than butt chewing? Just a suggestion. Story 30. My first infant not breathing call. I was fresh off work, working the midnight tour. The mother and father were both understandably hysterical. I could hear him in the background yelling obscenities, telling me to stop asking questions and get the ambulance there. She was sobbing so hysterically over the phone that I could barely confirm the address of the emergency. Neither of them were listening to the CPR instructions I was trying to give. No amount of repetitive persistence was going to bring them back from the brink. I stepped out for a break after that call. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I was numb to it all at first. I knew their baby was dead from what the mother described, and no amount of CPR was going to change that. My supervisor took me to the side and asked if I needed a CISD after that. It's like a way for emergency personnel to deal with traumatic experiences by talking to a trained professional. I think he could tell I was in some sort of shock after the call. I stubbornly refused, and I probably shouldn't have. Story 31. Not an operator myself, and this happened in the UK. My sister had mental health issues since about 11. As a regular self-harmer, in November 2018, she cut a vein in her arm and rang for ambulance/paramedic assistance. However, due to her mental instability and drug/alcohol abuse, this night she was on the phone to emergency services for 45 minutes. The operator was trying to assess the situation and get information such as my sister's address. From my sister's point of view, the operator wasn't helping her, so my sister turned abusive toward the operator. However, due to my sister's mental state at the time, she was switching between being abusive and crying/begging for help. The operator failed to get the correct information in time. After an hour, an ambulance was finally sent to my sister's flat, but she was pronounced dead at the scene. Me and my family aren't holding the operator responsible at all. My mother has written a letter to the operator to explain the situation from our side. I heard the operator was pregnant at the time and was very traumatized by these events. She took an extended leave of absence before her maternity leave. I've also been told she may never return to the job because of these events. Me and the family have not been told to listen to the call as it is very traumatizing. Definitely something the operator or our family will never forget. Story 32. I helped deliver a couple of babies, which was awesome and a positive in a largely negative job. I'll never forget the time that girl called and said her friend shot himself. She didn't know the address of where they were, but she knew the general location. I had to tell her to look around and yell out everything she saw. I used the satellite view on Google Maps to find her location based on what she told me. Helping parents perform CPR on a newborn is one of the worst things, and I probably have more, but digging that stuff up isn't always the greatest. Story 33. The first truly serious call I took was for an essay. A woman in her 20s had just procured a well-paying job and went to the club to celebrate with her friends. Met up with a local musician and invited him back to her room. She was down to bang, but he wanted butt stuff, and she said no. He did it anyway, very aggressively. I got the call a few hours later. She's just softly crying into the phone. She gives me the basic details and I dispatch the police. But we need to stay on the line with the caller until they arrive. Those few minutes it took for the police to arrive, I think about them more than I care to admit. I tried my best to console her, but all she did was cry softly into the phone and kept repeating two phrases. It's all my fault, and there's so much blood. She ended up dropping the whole thing. She was worried that it would reflect poorly on her new job, which in the field she was in, she was right. Nothing ever happened to the guy, and I still see his name around sometimes. I don't know what field this woman was in, but that makes me so mad that she had to choose between her livelihood or getting justice for a genuinely awful crime. It's stuff like this that really makes you realize the system is hooped, man. And I know that's just a general statement that really means nothing, but I'm frustrated, okay? Story 34. On my second full-time shift, it was about 11 p.m. on a Thursday. We get a call from a woman screaming, just screaming. That's all we heard. We lost connection. Second 911 call from the neighbor across the street. They say they think they just heard a gunshot, and now their neighbor is screaming, yelling for help. I think something terrible happened. While my partner was getting more info from caller number 2, 911 rings again and it's the original caller. She's still screaming but is trying to speak, even though I can't understand anything she's saying. After a couple very stern verbal slaps of, "Ma'am, I need you to calm down and tell me what's going on," she's finally able to tell me that she thinks her husband just offed himself. She went on to explain they were watching a TV show together and everything seemed normal. He got up and said he would be right back. Wife heard the back deck door open and close, and then she heard a gunshot. She ran to the door and just saw his feet and legs lying down on the deck. She was called initially but was unable to control herself and accidentally hung up. She was still a complete disaster when I talked to her, but I was able to get the basics of what happened and relay the info to responding officers and fire. She kept telling me that she needed to go outside and help him. Do I need to go out there? Do you need me to go out there? I don't want to see him. I can't see him. My only job at that point was to try and keep her calm and keep her from getting up from the corner of the kitchen floor where she had collapsed until police arrived and secured the weapon. They had been married 27 years, 2 kids, 3 grandkids, lived a happy life together. She had no indication that anything was wrong. Her husband got up from the couch, walked out onto the back porch, and blew his head off with a black powder pistol. I don't remember her name, but I will never be able to forget her screams. Story 35. Student paramedic here. Had a call being general broadcasted over radio when I was chilling in base with my mentor. We were on a 2-man car ambulance. Operator who was broadcasting said something along the lines of, "Female, reportedly unconscious, police on scene, major trauma." Pause. CPR in progress, confirmed arrest by police on scene. My mentor looks at me. We're off in 30 minutes at the end of a night shift, but we go anyway. We're around the corner, make it there in no time at all. There are police everywhere, at least 7 squad cars. I'm nervous as hell, and so is my mentor. As we approach the house, a man emerges handcuffed by police. He looks content enough and smiles at us as we walk by. Police shout for us to hurry. We run with equipment to front door and are met with one of the worst scenes I've ever seen, and it will always be there in my mind. There's a woman lying on the ground with the left side of her head caved in, blood absolutely all over the place, and brain matter scattered around the floor too. Police are doing CPR. We stop them when we see the patient has signs of pooling and rigor mortis. I'm literally sweating and on the verge of tears. This is not how I wanted my shift to end. Then we hear from behind us more police in the house and the sounds of children. 2 kids are escorted out of a bedroom behind us with their eyes covered. One of them asks, "What's going on? Where's mommy?" My heart melted. I've never been exactly traumatized by a job, but those kids being shielded from what just happened to their mother will stick with me forever. I bring equipment back to my ambulance as my mentor starts to do paperwork, and we wait for someone to move the body. Social services arrive and take the kids, blissfully unaware of what's just happened. Was off 3 hours late after all the paperwork and interviewing from police. Good job, but man, it left its mark on me. Story 36. I had 3. 2 horrifying and 1 kind of funny. I think I'll just share the funny one. I took a call for an HOD. Before I finish, positive outcome. No one dies. Cardiac arrest. It just happened. Male in his 20s. His girlfriend and his friend call. They are very compliant after a little distress. The girlfriend is actually fairly awesome even though she's stoned. She gets right into CPR, listening to my instructions. I see on my screen the ambulance has arrived and I'm calmly starting to prepare her for them coming in. Minutes pass and no one has entered the house. I'm used to a little delay, but this is unusual. I'm about to flag my supervisor, but she's on her way over from dispatch. "Hey, OP, can you ask the caller to tell her friends to stop throwing deck chairs? Our guys can't get in until they do." Apparently, this was a druggy house, and there were a couple of others standing up on the first floor balcony throwing deck chairs. I tell the girlfriend, "Hey, can you ask your friends to stop throwing deck chairs? We can't get our officers in while they're doing that, and we might have to call the police." She just says, "What the hell?" The phone drops and I can hear her yelling in the background. Stuff being thrown, and I'm trying to get some attention back because I think CPR has stopped. Finally, there's quiet, and I can hear the ambos enter the house and take control, so I end the call. I checked in with the crew later, and they told me these guys were off their faces and thought the ambos were there to steal their things. So they defended their territory or something with deck chairs. It's always left me wondering, how many damn deck chairs did they have? Story 37. I was a dispatcher for a residential alarm company similar to ADT. I would call people when their alarm was tripped and ask them if they were okay. One day I received a signal from a residence from a glass break sensor on a window in the bathroom. When I called, the lady was laughing so hard she could barely give me her security password. Turns out she was cleaning her bathroom, and when she bent over, she farted so hard and loud it set off the sensor on the bathroom window. Story 38. Not an operator, but I worked as a lifeguard on the beach in NC for a while and had a radio, which was used to dispatch both us and EMTs if somebody called 911. So I got to hear some gnarly crap. The best one was during the remnants of one of the hurricanes in the US, summer of 2017. My coworker and I were hunkered down under a jetty on our quad bikes for shelter when we heard a dispatch for EMTs being called out. A few districts down from us, a big, heavy wooden umbrella had been picked up by a sudden strong gust of wind and driven through an 84-year-old woman's face, pointy end first. In through the mouth, out through the jaw. My coworker and I simply looked at each other and started screaming. Last we heard, she was in the care of the EMTs. Never did find out anything else. Story 39. Breech birth via interpreter. The caller was alone and didn't know her address. Two men in full pirate costumes eating burritos from the trash, climbing rooftops and throwing baby powder, raccoon breaking into an elderly woman's house and barricading her in her closet, officer involved shooting, the officer lived after being shot 7 times, hostage standoff. I was online with the suspect for 2 hours after a 14-hour shift as he repeatedly stabbed himself with a kitchen knife, and my favorite. 2 guys think they're witnessing a murder and body disposal. They described a naked body covered in blood being thrown into the dumpster. It was pizza dough and sauce. The workers were just having a grand old time throwing away extras. Story 40. Hard to pick just one. So many memories that will never leave me. I was training a paramedic to answer calls and this eerie dude called. Lots of heavy breathing, weird metal sounds clicking in the background. Told us he had serious bleeding but would not specify from where or what. My paramedic trainee whispered to me his paramedic friends were going to this job. He whispered it in a happy, not concerned voice, and I was freaking out. I had chills. The caller said stuff like, "Please don't turn the ambulance lights on. Park around the back. I don't want anyone knowing you're here." And, "I'm upstairs and the door's unlocked, and sorry, no lights in my house work." All in a, I will murder someone soon kind of way. We radioed the crew and told them to not go in, and police have been dispatched, to stand off until they arrived. But of course we stayed on the line with the heavy breathing guy who said that he was in the upstairs cupboard waiting. Next thing I knew, I heard the paramedics' voices call out, "Where are you?" And the police were still 15 minutes away. I totally thought they would die. Like, the paramedic's voice is in my head forever, and that helpless look on my trainee's face. We were all silent and the caller was heavy breathing, not responding. Then, just a, "There you are, I found you. You were in the cupboard. How can I help?" "Oh, here, let me help you hang up the phone." The paramedics didn't die, but the dude was sitting in the closet with a gun and bullets. And he had cut his nutsack open and was stuffing it full of tissues. To stop the bleeding, I guess. Story 41. Around 7 a.m., male calls and says his wife is non-responsive, difficulty breathing after her night shift at Waffle House. I dispatch in northern Kentucky. So an opioid overdose is suspected and probable. The caller was defensive and didn't want to answer questions, and I heard him talking to his young daughter in the background. The squad got there and confirmed overdose. 2 doses of Narcan revived her, and they transported her to the hospital. Basically the most normal and best outcome overdose call I could deal with. Around 1 p.m. the same day, I get a call from a very scared, but as calm as can be, young girl. I answered the phone, "Where is your emergency?" To which she answered, "Daddy did what Mommy did." I didn't get it at first. I had probably taken 3 or 4 more overdose calls that morning, so it didn't click. She told me he was breathing a little, but couldn't tell me her address. I couldn't send anyone to her without knowing where she was. I remembered my trainer saying something about getting a license plate from outside if a child, maybe a diabetic patient, calls and is not able to give an accurate address. Got the plate, got the registered owner's address, and then it clicked. This child had to witness both of her parents overdosing at the age of about 7. I want to hug whoever taught her to call 911. Having an 8-year-old daughter now just makes me want to hug her. Story 42. There are a few. My first murder call. It really tore me up. It was a kid around 9 that called for his mom and grandmother. Their dad had a gun to their heads and I couldn't make out the address for anything. All I heard were the numerics. Then, a loud pop. No more screaming, and the kid's voice still haunts me to this day. He just said, "He just offed my mum." The grandmother fled in fear and he chased her down and offed her too. I beat myself up over it for a long time. Another was my first SIDS call. The screams of the parents still give me nightmares to this day. Story 43. One Thursday morning I took a call from someone who had just witnessed someone taking their own life. They did it by jumping in front of a truck in a rural area. Through her description of the patient and how far away emergency services were, I could tell she wasn't going to make it. But I got the caller and other witnesses doing CPR and first aid to at least feel like they were doing something to help. It doesn't play on my mind too much, but I think about it every now and then. Those bystanders who were on scene did a really good job given the situation, and that's a positive aspect I like to take from it. If something ever happens to me in public, I can only hope the people around me are like those bystanders. I feel like my odds are lower not being in a rural sort of community, but still, the idea that people will help with all they can, even if the outcome isn't looking favorable, that is really sweet. I'm sorry for what they had to witness that day, but I'm proud of them coming together as a community. Story 44. Not me, but a friend was working the incoming police calls during July 22nd, 2011 in Norway. She spent a lot of time in therapy after that day. It starts with an incoming call as usual, but she was oblivious to the fact that other calls had started coming in from Utøya Island and answered her call completely unprepared. As soon as she answered the call, her ears were filled with true and raw terror. A young girl whispering with a voice so scared and trembling that it was hard to hear her clearly. "He's here. Please come help us. Oh my God, he's here. I can hear him. I can hear the shots. He's shooting at us. Where are you?" And this was just repeated several times. The girl at the other end never answered my friend's questions. She was too scared. Then suddenly a shot is heard and the voice stops. My friend hears more shots and cries for help, then more shots moving away. The call still active. My friend gets up and can see other police officers running around, bewildered looks. Chaos erupts as the carnage has just hit the police. She handled a lot of calls from terrified children and teenagers that day, and what haunts her to this day was her inability to actually communicate with them through their terror. Almost every call ended abruptly or completely without the kids hearing her questions, answers, and information. Story 45. One of my best friends was a 911 operator, now a nurse. She got pretty messed up by a call from a mom who had found her 14-year-old son after he had taken his own life. It sort of brought to light for me just how little support many dispatchers get in terms of help with PTSD. She missed a few weeks of work, needed therapy that was all out of pocket because somehow that's not workers' comp eligible. It's one of the big reasons I'm very much in support of parity and benefits for dispatchers and tow truck drivers, as I am for traditional first responders, police/fire. There's also a huge additional problem that a lot of EMTs/paramedics are employed by shifty companies that don't provide nearly the kind of comprehensive benefits that governments provide to firefighters and police. We have some pretty messed up systems with wildly varying levels of help available for the exact same event, depending on who your employer is. We need a more comprehensive basic safety net for these people to help them get through tough times induced by their jobs. Story 46. I've been a police officer for the better part of 2 years. In my short tenure, I've had the great pleasure of saving a few lives, including a 2-year-old who was purple and at the bottom of a pool when I arrived on scene. She lived, and oddly enough, I went to school with the parents of this child. However, that is unfortunately not my most memorable call. It has to be a tie between two of the most gruesome scenes I've ever had to handle. The first being an apparent taking of one's own life. We were just clearing the station and the call goes out that this man had shot himself in the bathroom while his wife was in there showering. Sure enough, the whole squad and I show up, and this lady runs out holding a 2-year-old baby and she is screaming in horror, crying, begging for us to save him. However, there wasn't much left to save. Single shot to the head and plenty of brain matter. As I entered the room and smelled the iron in the air, I verified with rescue he was deceased and proceeded to comfort the wife. The lady sobbed on my shoulder for 10 minutes, asking me why, asking me how, asking me what was it that she did. To this day, I can't shake the feeling I get when I pass that neighborhood. The second story is quite short and simple. After working a scene for a shooting, I get sent on a check for a welfare call. I work in a rural area. However, our country stretched wide, and I end up west into a large swampland. The area is primarily inhabited by migrant workers and people who just prefer simpler living away from society. Essentially, I arrive at this shanty town of 3 to 4 makeshift trailers with racked-on porches. I wouldn't call the living conditions fit for an animal, truth be told. My reporting person was a 45-year-old male who hadn't heard from his 75-year-old father in 2 weeks. Upon my arrival, I could smell the smell. If you work in this line of work, you know what I'm talking about. It's the one where your skin crawls and you're already thinking, I'm gonna need to grab the tape. I don't do that just yet. I make my way to the trailer where the smell is becoming more rancid. Upon the doorsteps to the porch lay the rotting remains of a kitten, skeletal and some meat still there, yet to be picked off by the vermin. I approach the trailer door, and from the bottom of the door I can see the spill. For those of you who don't know, once the human body sits for too long, it essentially liquefies. This man was so far gone that his spill had been seeping out. I have fire rescue break the door down, and sure enough, right off beside the bedside is the father, long gone, essentially rotten after having sat inside the trailer for at least a week and a half in southern Florida heat and humidity in the summertime. It is the sight of a human body so decayed and so far gone that I will never forget it. Unfortunately for me, I'm used to the smell, so whereas my partner couldn't get past the kitten, I was left to do the actual police work and inspect the corpse for signs of trauma. Believe it or not, it's rather hard to do when you have a corpse so muddy and face sunken in that you can't even identify the deceased. I will never forget that day. I will never forget what I saw, and I'll never stop wondering how that kitten died on that porch. Story 47. One that sticks with me is a 14-year-old girl that calls the police for a disturbance. Officers show up and everything seems average. Parents advise that the reporting party is upset because she isn't allowed to go out with her boyfriend. Officers are getting ready to leave after being there for 40 minutes, but something seems off to them. The two officers take the 14-year-old outside and near their patrol units to speak to her. While they're walking outside, the girl's mother, stepfather, and two sisters go and stand on the porch to see if they can see what's going on. They're unable to hear due to their officers and the girl being on the other side of the street. It was then when the stepfather started pacing and went inside. The girl breaks down, tells the officers that her stepdad has been S.A.ing her for years, and he didn't want her to go see her boyfriend because he was jealous. The officers look up, and at that moment they see the stepfather shoot the mother in the back of the head. He proceeds to shoot the reporting party's older sister in the chest and her younger sister in the leg as they started running away. One officer returns fire while the other is shielding the reporting party. The stepfather runs in and barricades himself. The reporting party tells the officer that her two brothers are inside with the stepfather. Backup arrives and surround the home. The officers make forced entry after they hear gunfire from inside. They storm the residence and find the stepfather has shot himself in the head with his two biological sons in the same room. The mother died instantly. The older sister died instantly. The younger sister was hospitalized. I don't know if she made it, just knew that she flew to a hospital miles away. This 14-year-old lost her family. Later, the investigators were taking her statement, and her only reply was, "The last time I tried to tell someone the truth, I lost my family. Doesn't matter what I say now, I'm alone." It took hours to get in contact with the family. Eventually, we were able to get in touch with her grandparents, and she was left with them. I think about this kid a lot and hope she's okay. I think it's when I hear about stories like these that I really, really hope there might be a hell just for people like this. The absolute rotten scum of the earth. The people who are willing to take lives and ruin lives all for themselves, basically. What an absolutely rotten excuse of a human being that man is. Sorry, man is the wrong word. That animal. Story 48. A lot of sad ones here, so I'll go lighthearted. This was one of the first calls I've ever gotten. It was a night shift call around 10 p.m. Lady calls in that her husband has overdosed, trying to off himself. Protocol says we have to get the police en route and have the medics stage a little ways away from the scene for safety purposes. People on drugs can be crazy after all. Our dispatch center only sends out fire/medics, so we don't have direct contact with the police. We have to call their dispatcher to get officers en route. The guy that overdosed was still conscious, and his wife didn't know what he had taken, so we definitely couldn't send the ambulance in first. This particular area was way out in the country, backwoods Alabama, so we have volunteer fire departments to cover it. They aren't the brightest of firemen. They're very ready to get into action, and they live for this crap, even though they don't get paid for it. This is important to note. So after a few minutes, one police officer gets on scene, and right after that, the ambulance and VFD arrives at the staging area. A few minutes later, a second police officer arrives on scene. Then about 5 minutes later, a third officer. This is very unusual, as typically one officer gets on scene and says it's secure, and we send medics in to evaluate the patient and transport him either to the hospital or to jail. But we haven't heard anything at this point from the police dispatch. Over the volunteer radio frequency, I hear the gung-ho volunteer come over and say, "911, this is VFD1. There are 3 sheriffs on scene. I'm gonna proceed on up there." And immediately he's interrupted by a police officer who never uses that frequency. "Negative VFD1, negative. Do not approach my scene." We all died laughing up here, but that's when we knew something was up. I found out later that while the police were on the scene, this man had tried to off himself again. 1, he had somehow gotten a hold of a gun, pointed it at his head, and it misfired. 2, he then fought off 2 officers, got a knife, and cut his arm the wrong way trying to off himself. 3, then somehow got away from 3 officers who freaking tased him and ran outside. 4, he climbed a giant TVA electricity tower not far from his house. And 5, grabbed something up top of the tower trying to electrocute himself to die. He survived, but set off an explosion that knocked out power for a nearby city. Well, during all this, the fine folks of backwoods Alabama all started coming out of their houses, which led to a great mix of Bud Light and Copenhagen drama. The VFD medics and ambulance rolled up to the scene, waiting to see how they would get this guy down. The rednecks all started bringing mattresses out and put them below the tower, as if that was going to help this guy survive a 60-plus foot fall. As this was going on, one of the family members was in a mood and tried to fist fight the ambulance crew. He got arrested, and we had to send another ambulance for our first ambulance. Just after the assailant was being put in the cop car, old redneck Rasputin decided he had enough. He jumped off of the tower. When he jumped, his aunt and cousin both passed out in the middle of the street, so we needed more ambulances for them. Redneck Rasputin ended up bouncing off of the metal beams and landed on the mattresses and somehow survived. The fall knocked him unconscious, and they loaded him up and took him to the hospital, and that was the end of his adventure. This guy had OD'd, tried to shoot himself, tried to cut himself, fought with 3 police officers, tried to shock himself and tried to off himself with gravity, and survived it all. A few hours later, and 4 ambulances in total, for reference, our county typically has 5 in service, he ended up going to jail, and as far as I know, is still alive and kicking until this day. Okay, 2 things. First of all, OP, this is a lighter one? You just talked about a man who wanted to end his own life 5 times in a row. That's a lighter one in the threat? That's the bar. I gotta get another job, man. Anyway, someone or something out there is trying to keep this guy alive. We don't know why, but they are. Story 49. 112 dispatcher amongst other things. My job is actually a fireman, but due to the structure of the fire department where I live, we are also taking calls. Anyway, got a call once from a lady who wanted assistance because she fell on the floor, lived alone, and had trouble standing up. Pretty common. I sent a crew out there. They come back and they tell me she was kind of disappointed. This call kept happening for the next few days till we understood what was going on. She had a crush on one of my colleagues, and she just wanted him to visit her. When she finally put together when his shift was working, they only had her calls ever since. Story 50. I used to work for 111, which is the UK's non-emergency line, but at least a third of the calls we would take would be emergency calls or potential emergency calls, heart attacks, strokes, etc. I remember a lot of emergency calls. Patients who wanted to take their own lives, patients who had only just stopped breathing and the people with them refused to do CPR, but the one that hit me the hardest was a miscarriage. I had a young, single woman call late at night, screaming in agony, in absolute panic for her baby, completely unable to move to open the door to let the emergency services in. Fortunately, we were able to pass the dispatch details of any emergency call directly to 999, even though we had to stay online with the patient. And I remember having to sit there listening to this poor woman have a horrifically painful miscarriage, and the absolute distress she was in at losing her baby, whilst she was all alone with no family to call on. I felt completely helpless. All I could do was stay on the line with her and tell her help was on the way. Story 51. I'm no operator, but I know of a good one that no one in my family will ever forget. My cousin has fetal alcohol syndrome and paranoid schizophrenia. At this time, she was about 22 and Justin Bieber was first starting to rise to stardom. That's important for later. My aunt never knew how to properly care for my husband, and as a result, she was left largely uncared for. My aunt put her in a small apartment in a bad part of town, and my cousin started getting in trouble with the authorities a lot. She didn't know how to take care of herself and would break the law without even realizing it. Stealing, public nudity, touching or threatening people, and since people don't know how to handle someone like her, she would get scared and fight back, and lots of arrests for attacking an officer. Her apartment was also regularly burgled, since people started figuring out she didn't lock her doors, and if they stole her TV, a new one would magically appear, courtesy of my aunt, all to steal again. My cousin never called these in, however. One day my aunt is contacted by the police regarding my cousin, and we're all assuming it's the usual, but they say she reported breaking and entering as well as burgling and kidnapping. We were all very confused. They then asked if we knew anyone who went by the name Justin Bieber. Here's what happened. My cousin had a severe schizophrenic episode in which she hallucinated that she not only had a baby, but that Justin Bieber had broken into her house and stole said baby. So she called it in. The police came and found her apartment properly burgled, so they started investigating. Never found the guy who actually stole her stuff, but the police quickly established that a baby was not among the stolen property, and that Biebs was on tour and could not possibly have done the deed. But then again, never say never. Story 52. I'm no 911 operator, but I read about a call that I will never forget. A woman called 911 but pretended to call a pizza delivery hotline because her abusive boyfriend might find out. The operator thought it was a prank when she said she wanted to order pizza, but luckily the operator figured out what was really happening and asked her, "You can't talk about it because there's someone in the room with you?" The conversation is this. I just admire the cleverness of the woman. 911, what's your emergency? 123 Main Street. Okay, what's going on there? I'd like to order a pizza for delivery. Ma'am, you've reached 911. Yes, I know. Can I have a large with half pepperoni, half mushroom and peppers? I'm sorry. You know you've called 911, right? Yeah. Do you know how long it will be? Okay, ma'am. Is everything okay over there? Do you have an emergency? Yes, I do. And you can't talk about it because there's someone in the room with you. Yes, that's correct. Do you know how long it will be? I have an officer about a mile from your location. Are there any weapons in your house? No. Can you stay on the phone with me? No. See you soon. Thanks. Story 53. As a former 911 operator in Brazil, I was used to getting violent phone calls. Murder, people taking their own lives, threats, I've heard them all. Oddly enough, the one phone call that I could never forget wasn't a horrifying or urgent one. It was an old man telling me calmly that his house had been broken into. He just said with the saddest voice I've ever heard, "I've worked my entire life to buy these things. Now it's all gone. I've lost everything." He started crying on the phone and my heart broke. This man was quite poor and worked a lot to buy furniture and appliances through the years. He was now retired and couldn't afford to buy these things anymore. Most Brazilians don't have home insurance, so if your things are stolen, you don't see that money again. I asked the officer who went to his house to get a direct report, and he told me that the old man's house had been looted clean. He really did lose everything. I hope he's doing all right now. Something like this must be really tough to listen to. When someone truly loses everything, it's almost like their life has been taken in a way, or at least a large part of it. And I can only imagine hearing someone go through the process of realizing that and just thinking about it, that would be pretty heartbreaking. I don't think I would wish this on anyone. Well, no one who isn't truly evil, I guess. But really, I also hope the man is doing all right now. But that's a tough situation to bounce back from. Story 54. I used to take 911 calls for my county in Maine, and then I dispatched for the largest town in the county. I know a lot of the people at the 911 call center very well, so if there was a call they sent over to me for dispatch that was interesting/weird/hard, they'd message me on our system asking about it. 2 calls in my time there stand out quite a bit. When I was working the 911 side of things, about a week into call taking I had a trainer right there with me. I got a call from one of our rural towns. Most of the towns are fairly rural. It was a 9 to 10-year-old boy telling me his mom was in the front seat of her truck and that she wasn't breathing and wouldn't wake up. I had to walk him through dragging his mom out of the seat and onto the ground so he could start CPR. Because of where he was located, it took about 15 minutes for the first EMT to get there. We found out later she had OD'd on H about 12 hours before that, and her legs wouldn't flatten out, but stayed in a seated position. The other was when I was dispatching. The guy called 911, gave his address and phone number and confirmed them both. When asked for his name, he simply said he didn't want to be found by his family and hung the phone up. One of the guys I knew at the call center let me know all of this and said he had a really bad feeling. I sent 2 officers because I did as well. The officers arrived about 4 to 5 minutes after the initial call came in, and he had already shot himself in the head. The worst part of this was his mom, mother-in-law, brothers, and wife called in every 20 to 30 minutes asking for updates because he made a Facebook post with a link to a website he'd created as his note. I wasn't able to tell them anything more than officers are there and will contact you shortly. The website copied and pasted in a Word had 15 to 20 pages worth of writing, mostly to his younger son, about how he was better off without him in his life, and how it was better that he was dead. Story 55. I have a happier story for you guys. Obligatory notice that I was not a 999 operator, but a family member of mine was, hence how I know the story. An old woman called extremely confused because she says there's an elephant in her back garden. She's questioned, but she's insistent there is a fully grown elephant in her garden. She's frightened, probably because she thinks, well, there's an elephant in her back garden. Now, the immediate assumption is the woman may have dementia, because obviously there's not an elephant in her garden in England, so an officer sent to do a welfare check on the poor woman. Then the officer calls for backup because he got to her house, she let him inside and took him through the kitchen to look at the garden. Yup, there's an elephant, and it's eating her plants. Turns out there was a circus relatively nearby and the elephant had escaped overnight. I can't imagine that officer was trained for that scenario, or anyone for that matter. They would have to get animal control in on this or something. I don't know. Escaped elephants are not common, and I bet the insurance for that circus is either through the roof or done with them. Story 56. It's hard to say what will always stick with me because I try not to dwell on the really bad stuff, so here's some random thoughts. The first time I helped to deliver a baby was stressful as hell. I remember picking up the phone and getting a "this call is gonna be rough" feeling. Second time I knew what to do. Any domestic is rough because you can never tell how serious it is, and you have to make sure you treat it as serious as possible. I just had one today where the woman kept saying she didn't feel safe but wouldn't elaborate. She told me she got a cab and hung up on me and wouldn't answer calls back. When cops got on scene, it was just her husband. What is he gonna say? Another woman claimed she was kidnapped. I had to stick with yes or no questions. Cops finally get her on the highway. She gets a ride back to the station. The men she was with didn't. I have no idea what happened after that. There was recently a kitten that got tossed in a toll booth. It was rescued though. I want to adopt it, but right now I don't have the ability to care for a cat. Off-duty firefighters are always so freaking rude. You'd think they know that first responders can't fly. If they mention they're a firefighter, there's like a 30% increase, I'm gonna get screamed at. Story 57. Not a 911 operator, but was an EMT in an urbanish area for a few years. The call in question was super straightforward. Dude was mid to late 60s. Went out into the woods behind his house and then, well, shot himself in the head. It was my first month on the job, and the first call I got about someone taking their own life. I remember thinking it was kind of odd because he was pretty far back in the woods and laid out a tarp underneath him before he did it. And then we went into the house before we left to talk to the other officer on scene, and everything in the whole house was packed up and in boxes. The officer showed us a note where the guy talked about how much it hurt him when his wife died, how he didn't have any other family, and then there was a long apology for doing it. He said he packed everything into boxes, cleaned the house, and laid out the tarp to be as considerate as possible of whoever ended up being stuck dealing with his estate. He didn't want to be a burden, but just couldn't deal with it anymore. I can't even really articulate what it is about this that stuck with me. Maybe the lengths he went to. I don't know. But every now and then I think of him and it just makes my heart sad. Story 58. One night I got a call from a guy as calm as can be who said he needed help. Honestly, I thought it was a noise complaint being called in on 911. I get his address and information and ask what's going on tonight. He says his wife is in labor. I straighten up a little bit and he says that she's delivered one and it's not breathing. I tell him we need to do CPR. As calm as can be, he just says, I can't. They're both stillborns. For some reason I still don't understand since I'm not a doctor, they told them they had to be carried to term and delivered. I sat on the phone as he coached her through delivering the other, offered the obligatory CPR again, which he declined, and then just listened to them cry until the fire department got there. In over a decade, it's the only time I've ever cried on a call. Being a twin myself, I just can't fathom my parents having to go through that. It gave me chills just typing this again after all these years. Look, I'm not a doctor either, not even close. But doesn't something seem just deeply, deeply wrong with having to bring two stillborns to term? Not only is that absurdly physically taxing, but the mental toll it must take on you. I wish that woman and her husband nothing but the best. I don't even have words to describe how screwed over I think they got, just in so many aspects. Story 60. There are so many I'll never forget as long as I live, but there are two that stand out. The first was one of the very first 911 calls I ever took as a dispatcher on my own. It was right at the beginning of the shift. I got a call from a woman who was screaming and crying hysterically. Thank God she called from a landline, or I doubt I would have gotten an address out of her. It turns out she'd woken up that morning and saw the lights on in the garage. This was unusual because her husband always turns it off when he leaves for work, so she goes to investigate. When she gets to the garage, she finds him laying there with a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the chest. This is where I tried to get her to control the bleeding since she said he was still breathing, but the whole time she was just screaming and begging him not to leave her and the kids, asking him how he could do this to her. Her screams and pleading cries are something I can still hear clear as a day, and it's almost been a decade. Unfortunately, there was nothing we could do even though we made it on scene within 6 minutes from the start of the call. The second has a happier ending. It was the wee hours of the morning when the call came in. It was a woman who was frantic and hysterical. Her 6-month-old infant was unconscious, not breathing, and had turned blue. I get the call entered and then start trying to walk her through infant CPR. I had to speak a little more forcefully than normal to get her attention and break through the hysterics to get her to listen to me, but she finally did and started CPR. I kept pace for her and kept encouraging her until responders got on scene and took over. They were able to get a pulse back, and by the time they got to the hospital, the infant was breathing on its own again. I will always remember that one, because even if I never have another successful CPR call, at least it made a difference once when it really counted. There are tons more and I'd be glad to share if interested, but I've already written a wall of text. Story 61. It's not an official number, but I hope it counts too. I voluntarily work for a crisis counseling line for minors. One of the most important things for us is that the person calling is totally anonymous. We're not allowed to take any personal data, and there are very strict rules for us to call the police. You would basically need someone to tell you he will commit a crime, address and time confirmed, then has to go through 3 instances until we inform the police and may look at the calling number. One time we had this girl calling. She was in her early teens, I guess like 13. It started harmless as she talked about her strict parents and her problems with them. But then she told us about the rules. She wasn't allowed to decide what she was wearing. She wasn't allowed to wear underwear. She had to accept there were unknown men visiting her at home. She had to go at least once a week with her aunt to something that was like a strange hall, where she and other minors, most of them female, everyone at least half naked, had to stay for some time. There were adults around watching them. Sometimes girls left with the adults. It was like this since several years ago, like age 8 or something, with a growing amount. And as she was separated from normal, healthy peers, she only recently realized that what happened to her was probably not normal. She noticed it because she got an intimate piercing recently. She knew she was too young for that, so that was her point. And there were like 5, not sure the exact number, but may have also been 3 to 10 adult males plus her parents in the room with her watching. It was horrifying to even listen to that. I can't imagine how this girl may have felt, and I'm quite sure she didn't tell about everything. And to know that there's probably a ring of creepers and professional child abusers somewhere doing this to their own children, and there's absolutely nothing I could do about it, that's something you don't forget fast. There are other hard calls from time to time, but mostly just tragic events without any clear perpetrators. Story 62. I'll never forget this one. It was a 72-year-old female collapsed in front of her husband and stopped breathing. When I answered the phone, he said, "What do I do first? She's not breathing and I'm by myself." I told him to run and get the door unlocked, and then we can start chest compressions. Halfway through them, his back started hurting. I told him I didn't want him to hurt himself, and he told me, "I can't stop. I love her. We just celebrated 50 years together." Then he's saying things like, "You can't leave me. You're all I have. You can't die. I love you." I just lost it. I never cry on the phone, but I did that day. To my great delight, they got her back. They got her back. They visited one day and made me cry all over again. I love them so much. Story 63. I'll tell 2 since mine aren't particularly scary. Mine is being an operator for ADT. I got a burglary alarm ring and called in. It was a little girl about 13 years old. She gave the correct password and said the alarm was legitimate. She was hiding in her bedroom closet whispering and said the intruder was definitely still in the house. I had someone transfer over so they could stay on the line with her while I called the cops. Their operator got on. I explained the situation. She called in officers and then was able to transfer into the phone call so she could stay online with the girl until the cops arrived. By the time they did, the burglar was gone, so nothing terrible happened, except for the shattering of a young girl's feeling of security. The second one was told to me by our trainer at ADT. I don't know all of the details that led up to what happened, but he had gotten a burglary alarm at a business and called in on it. The man who answered gave the correct password and was talking, and as my trainer and he were talking, the man on the line had his throat slit. Not sure about the aftermath, but hearing my trainer talk about that before I got on the phones made me a bit more nervous. Story 64. Not an operator, but my dad would sometimes work in the FAO, fire alarm office, if they needed an extra operator. Out of the hundreds of crazy stories he's told me, none make me lose my faith in humanity more than this one. He received a call one day from a middle-aged woman who immediately stated her emergency was that she was pooping and it had become stuck. She couldn't push it out or pinch it off. He said he asked her to repeat herself because he couldn't believe what he was hearing. She stuck to it, and he told her there was no way in hell they were sending anyone out for that, and hung up. Not a minute later, one of the other operators on the opposite side of the room gets a call, and it's the same woman, screaming about how she can't finish crapping and how she got hung up on. At this point, my dad and the other operators are like, "What the actual hell?" and leave her on the line for a bit to see how it would play out. Lo and behold, after a few minutes, she magically managed to finish taking a crap and wasting valuable emergency services time. My dad told me they filed a report against her for unlawful use of emergency services, but unfortunately, unless you abuse the system on multiple occasions, nothing will happen. I could see how this could be a genuine medical emergency. It wasn't in this case, obviously, but I could see it. And if someone has a history with that, I could see why they would want to call because they're really scared about it. I don't know. That being said, the fire alarm office? I don't know what that is, really, but now, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like they deal with fires, mostly. So I don't know what's going on here. Story 65. Transfer from primary agency for medical. Infant possibly not breathing / unconscious. Mother states foam and blood coming from baby's mouth. Mother won't stop yelling, not screaming, just being loud. That baby is dead. Have to speak to her sharply to get her to answer to me, as she's gone off on a rambling story about how she woke up from a nap and the baby was dead with blood coming from its mouth. I'm instantly suspicious because she doesn't sound scared or concerned or even truly angry, just irritated. I'm trying to get her to initiate CPR, as she hasn't stated baby is both cold and stiff, so per protocol I have to badger people in that scenario to start compressions. Mother refuses. I attempt to switch guilt. So you're refusing to help is an effective question to throw at people who are squeamish about compressions. At no point has she expressed sadness or anything. Her story suddenly changes after 2 minutes. Now, she didn't lay down for a nap. She was standing in her bedroom and something hit her in the back of the head, and when she woke up, the baby was dead. Now she can't remember anything. Still trying to get her to start CPR, but now I'm pumping her for information on a recorded line. Just kind of letting her talk while regularly trying to redirect her to start CPR. Mother lights cigarette. Won't stop saying I can't believe this is happening to me. Sounds like super entitled people when they want to talk to a manager. See her all over the news for having offed her baby the next day. Call out for 2 nights because I can't get her voice out of my head. When she changed her story, I could hear her smiling. Just the tone of her voice was her congratulating herself on coming up with a foolproof story. At one point, she even said yeah to herself like she was convincing herself. And I never want to listen to someone develop their lie that they intended to use to cover for offing their 2-week-old ever again. Story 66. I made a call I'll never forget, and I wish I could let the dispatcher know I made it. I had a sore throat for 2 days and woke up in the middle of the night because my throat had closed entirely and I couldn't breathe. I ran to the sink, forced a glass of water down my throat and got maybe 20% of my airway back. I had to shout as hard as I could to get the air out faster so I could start breathing in more again and not pass out. I called 911 and it took them 8 minutes to get to my apartment. The whole time the dispatcher was telling me to try to calm down and that they would be there soon. I remember begging for her to hurry, knowing it wouldn't matter what I said or did. There wasn't anything more I could do. I remember the subdued but present fear in her voice as she was trying to coach me through it, knowing that there wasn't anything more she could do either. I lasted barely long enough for the EMTs to get my apartment and emergency intubate me, basically shove a lubricated plastic tube down my throat. I ended up in and out of a 9-day medically induced coma, almost dying from pneumonia as one of my lungs filled with fluid. The recovery has taken a long time and the ordeal was way more difficult than it sounds from just this. It's amazing to me to realize that this little 8-minute conversation was a prelude to such a monumental experience in my life. I wish I could thank her. She did a good job. Story 67. My first year on the job, I was working alone one night, when we had a walk-in the lobby at 5:45 in the morning. She and her mother were requesting a welfare check on her brother's girlfriend. He had shown up unexpectedly at her apartment with his 3-year-old son and seemed upset. All he would say to her is, "It's over," over and over again. She stated her brother and his girlfriend had an on and off relationship and she was worried they'd gotten into a fight. The call is in my buddy's area, so I dispatch him. No answer at the door. I ask the supervisor what his pleasure is. He says to send the fire department to make forced entry. By this time, the patrol sergeant, poor guy was on an overtime shift, has joined my buddy, who's chatting on the phone with me. We're laughing over how this girl's probably gone to sleep after a breakup/argument, and the poor thing is gonna wake up to like 6 dudes in her bedroom demanding to know if she's okay. 99% of the time, that's how it goes. Well, it turns out this time, she was not okay. The boyfriend had strangled her to death in front of their kid, then dropped the kid off with his sister and mom, and screwed off to California. They caught him there about a year later, but we all wound up staying very, very late that day. I had to give a written and verbal statement to state police and later had to testify in front of a grand jury. The whole thing was pretty bonkers, especially for how relatively new I was. And this is a fantastic example of how if something happens 99% of the time, you still have to treat it as if that 1% is possible, because it is. And it's good that you all followed through. If for whatever reason this was dismissed, it may have been a lot harder to catch the guy, and you wouldn't have known as soon. Those are huge issues in the justice system. Definitely an unsettling reality when you were expecting something more mundane, though. Story 68. I will never forget this call because of how calm the caller was. I got this one last summer. I just sat down when a woman called in, calmly stating she was at a cottage with her fiancé on a lake in cottage country in my province. She was relaxing on a lawn chair on her dock when she looked across the bay and saw a man casually walking out holding a human head. He proceeded to swim around in the lake with it, screaming that he was free. I remember feeling absolutely horrible because I had to tell her she couldn't go inside or look away because I needed to know exactly where the man was for officer safety. Turns out the kid had hacked his own dad's head off with a machete and cut out his heart. The more senior operators even told me they feel sorry for me and they had never seen anything like that. Another call I won't forget is a girl who was beheaded when her cousin, and her sister were driving home from a party. They hit a tree and her sister called in. She said specifically there were 2 of us and 1 body. When I asked how she knew her sister was dead, she simply stated she doesn't have a head anymore. For some reason, the hysterical callers never really stuck. It was always the super calm ones. Story 69. Previous ambulance call handler, now dispatcher, soon to be EMT with a few to recall in no particular order. 1. Still remember my first cardiac arrest call address. 2. Received call from male driving to work. He got a phone call from one of his kids advising they couldn't wake mum, 35-year-old female, to take them to school. Triaged with the little information he had, obtained the landline number for the property and called his children. Ascertained pretty quickly with the kids on scene that mum wasn't breathing, giving instructions to an 8-year-old and 6-year-old on how to drag mum off the bed, and listening to them start CPR while crying their little hearts out is something that will always stick with me. They were audibly upset and panicking, but I think they were so naive to the severity of the situation, because I heard one of them saying to his brother, it's okay, the ambulance men will fix her." They were absolutely incredible, did everything I said and tried everything they could. Unfortunately, she was already deceased once crew arrived on scene. I still wish I could meet them to give them a hug, tell them how sorry I am, but how proud of them I was on that day. And 3. This is a difficult one to put into words, as I don't really know what the situation was. Took a call from dad of a 6-year-old female who had been found not breathing, stuck under a bar, and they couldn't clarify exactly what had happened. The parents weren't panicked. Mum sounded eerily calm in the background, gave resuscitation instructions, patient in respiratory arrest on crew arrival, blue lighted in, unsure of outcome. Police came into control room and obtained a recording of the call and asked me a few questions. I spoke to colleagues about it and speculated what may have happened. It almost sounded like this little girl got stuck under the crossbeam of a piece of furniture or something, I thought. It doesn't make sense how she got under it, nor how such a young person could manage to get underneath something of such a weight to cause this significant airway compromise. That one will stay with me because something is suspicious and just doesn't feel right about the whole incident. I checked the news for the local area for months to try to find answers to no avail. Story 70. My first 911 call after training. I was on my own 2 days after I was cut loose. My partner for the day had just gone to lunch, but told me to call her if I need any help at all. About 10 minutes later, 911 line went off, and when I answered, it was a guy at the mall who said that his 4-year-old fell down on the escalator and lost the thumb and first 2 fingers on her hand. I had been terrified of calls like this. I worked for a small department in a small town, so we didn't really get stuff like that. All I'd handled at that point was lift assists at the nursing home or false fire alarms and stuff like that. So when I get this call, my stomach dropped. But it was all just automatic. Send the fire department, get on the line with mall security to handle the crowd, get on the radio and get 2 squads into the building to get additional crowd control and establish a presence, find a detective, and assign him to help with the search for the fingers when they get the escalator torn down. It all happened in half a minute or so, and automatically. That was how I knew I could do the job. That was 12 years ago. She works at a cafe around here, and I run into her several mornings each week. They weren't able to reattach the fingers, but she's adapted. She also has no idea I took her call. It just never seemed appropriate to say anything, but it's nice to see she's doing well today. Story 71. I've had my share of delivering babies, assisting in CPR, blood control, etc. It was an actual dispatch issue that always makes me laugh. I figured a good laugh would be nice right about now. I worked for several years at an ambulance district that covered many rural areas and small municipalities that didn't have their own districts. We were 911 for 31 different municipalities, spanning both sides of the Mississippi River. One day a sick call came in for a male in distress. The caller apologized repeatedly but said they had no street signs. The instructions included, turn left at the green barn. If you see the cows, you've gone too far. I kid you not, it had the whole room laughing. I passed the information to the dispatchers who passed it on to the rig. For 25 minutes we listened to the confused medics unable to find them. All the while I was on the line with the caller who just kept repeating to turn at the green barn. Another several minutes of our rig being as lost as a piglet in Manhattan, the caller went silent. When they spoke again, they coughed, apologized, and said the barn had been painted red the week prior. This is rural 911, folks. You gotta do what you can, and sometimes you just roll with it. Story 72. I have a funny one to lighten up the thread. From my grandfather's time of being an operator. He received a call from a man on the side of the road. The man is asking all these questions about dead animals on the road and what to do if you hit one. My grandfather politely tells him to call animal control or wildlife fish and game, depending on the animal and if it's dead or not. But the man seems more frazzled and isn't truly asking what he wants to know. My grandfather's a no-nonsense kind of guy and goes, just spit it out already. The man just says, well, I'm asking if I hit and offed a deer with my car, can I take it home to eat it? My grandfather had a long silence, and technically, no, the man couldn't. It has to be reported to the wildlife office, but he also understood times were tough. Grandfather asks, have you already loaded the animal into your vehicle? Man says, yeah. And you're sure it's dead? Long silence as the man shuffles to check. My grandfather said he heard some distant screaming and swearing, a loud commotion, and then silence. The man suddenly comes back. Could you send an ambulance to my location? The buck dug an antler into my shoulder and got away. Story 73. I recently had a call where a mom came home to find her adult son's belongings all neatly set in piles, and each pile had a note with the name of who he wanted to give the items to. He had been going through a rough time recently. Lately split up with his wife. There were custody issues. Lost his job. There was no previous history of wanting to take his own life or anything. Finding his belongings like that was a terrifying red flag. His mom absolutely panicked, and I did everything I could to reassure her that we were taking this seriously, and we were throwing all of our resources into finding her son. Even through her panic, she was kind and polite, as I gathered as much information as I could. I got the call on screen almost instantly because I realized how serious this was. This isn't just a cry for help. We had to find this young man before he took his own life. We pinged his phone and got a location out of our jurisdiction with a huge radius. We requested the other police services' assistance and conveyed how critical this likely was. It broke my heart when he was found dead. We did everything we could to find him before he did it, and we failed. I'll never forget that call. Story 74. 000 in Australia, but same idea. Worst was a mother who was just screaming. This pure, primal, guttural anguish. Never heard such an awful sound in my life. After a lot of calming talk, I was able to get her address and discovered that she was screaming because she had just found the lifeless body of her 15-year-old son dangling from an electrical cord in his wardrobe. In her panic, she couldn't give me the required description of an obviously dead person, so I had to treat it as recoverable and get her to do CPR on his corpse, both of us knowing how futile it is. That one haunted me for a long time. Too many others to mention, but off the top of my head. Caller tells me about her boyfriend who has a laceration, but eventually reveals that she thinks he's possessed by the devil. I ask to speak to somebody else and get on to a very smart but terrified 12-year-old girl who says her mother has gone crazy and stabbed her boyfriend. Distressed woman who's lost in the outback, has no idea where she is or where she's been and only speaks Turkish, and spoke to a man who tried to commit seppuku. He stabbed himself in the abdomen and sliced it open, and his intestines were hanging out but undamaged. He was conscious, talking conversationally, very calm and cooperative. It's a hell of a job. Story 75. I'll share my mom's story because, well, she doesn't do the Reddit. She's a retired dispatcher who still fills in to help sometimes, and this is her favorite story. She gets a call one night from a local guy who considers himself the lone neighborhood watch. Incidentally, we'd seen him a lot because he mostly patrolled, and I use that term loosely, an area near our house. He was one of those retired, righteous do-gooder types that ironically inspired some 911 calls himself because, hey, this weird dude walks around the neighborhood all night. He'd call in a lot to report suspicious behavior. Real menacing stuff like kids on bikes after dark, or a car driving down a cul-de-sac only to turn around and drive out of it. One night he calls at about 2 a.m. and he's in complete hysterics. A group of kids had attacked him. My mom starts to take all this info of where he's at, how badly he's hurt, all those details. She's thinking an ambulance will be needed and starting to really worry for this cantankerous doom merchant. But he reveals, well, he's not really hurt. He was on his nightly patrol when a group of kids in a car had the audacity to drive by him and attack him. With what weapon? A gun? A rock? Their fists? No, they had thrown half a banana at him. So she tries to keep herself from losing her crap, laughing at her console, and says she'll have an officer contact him to take a report on this banana incident, and they hang up. Moments later, he calls back and he's losing his mind. He needs all the cops to descend on the neighborhood right this minute. These criminal ingrates return to attack him a second time. The weapon? The other half of the same banana. This guy was a card. She has a lot of sad and traumatic stories, but a lot of really funny ones too. 911 dispatchers deal with seriously awful moments, but I think most of her days just required consistent patience and empathy. The majority of her calls were from people who were drunk or high, spending most of the call yelling at her, local people with mental health needs who were scared or confused, and a lot of calls just for information to the non-emergency line. Story 76. Of course, I remember some doom and gloom, but I'll share a fun one. About 7 a.m., a younger-sounding female calls in. She's house-sitting and can hear someone trying to break in through the garage. Our city is long north to south, and the PD is towards the south side of the town. She was at the very north end in a nice neighborhood where nothing ever happens. Being early morning with, well, nothing going on, most officers are at the PD having just come on duty. Everyone starts towards the address, but it's going to be about a 10-minute code run. The caller's hiding in a closet and is petrified. I'd asked all the questions I could think of at this point and just keep telling her to let me know if she hears anything different. She can still just hear banging on the door to the garage. Suddenly, during a quiet moment, she yells out, "Oh my God!" After I picked up my heart from the floor and said, "What happened? Tell me," she said, "I think it's just the washing machine." Yeah, it was on spin cycle, banging up against the wall. Story 77. 1. Death of an infant. Call on the anniversary of my daughter's death, both 3 months old, but theirs was a boy. When I got off shift at 7 a.m., I was on body removal and had to pick up the baby and take it to the ME's office. I quit body removal after that shift. 2. 3 dead children calls on one 12-hour shift, all child abuse. One so bad, all medics, firefighters, and police that responded were taken off rotation for at least a week for mandatory therapy. 3. Man trapped in his car after an accident and caught on fire. While burning alive, made me promise to tell his wife and children he loves them and sorry he left them. 4. Assault victim fleeing naked while they were running trying to find her. Could hear the men calling for her while she was trying to whisper, hide, and run. So many horrific things come into dispatchers. Please don't call and yell because Taco Bell didn't give you change. That happens more often than you think. Dispatchers do want to help you, but first, we need to know where you are. Your cell phone doesn't tell us, 100%, no matter what it shows on TV. Story 78. Was a dispatcher for a country county. Got a call from a neighbor saying one of the neighborhood kids, 12, had shown up at their door bleeding pretty bad and barely able to talk. This was the middle of the night, and these houses were somewhere between 1 mile to 2 apart. Sent EMS and cops. They make it down the road and see tire tracks swerving off through a fence. Cops go back in and this car had ramped up the side of a dried up cattle pond and impacted the far side at about 90 miles per hour. 4 kids. 2 died instantly. 1 made the walk, and 1 was conscious enough to undo her seatbelt, curl up on the floorboards, and die, alone in the dark. All this because the mom at a sleepover had a few too many and thought it would be great to give her kids the keys for a joyride. All the kids were under 13. Story 79. My friend is a 911 operator and I've asked her this before. She had a call from a panicked woman who'd locked herself in her bathroom because her boyfriend was in an abusive rage and she said that he was going to off her. Police were dispatched to their home immediately. My friend stayed on the line with her and could hear her boyfriend trying to break down the locked bathroom door. The woman was hysterical, asking the police to hurry because he was going to off her. My friend said she could hear the boyfriend eventually break in and off her right there on the phone. She could hear the woman pleading with him, and she could hear him beating her to death. Cops were too late by about 5 minutes. She stayed on the line and to listen to her die. Couldn't do anything about it. That call haunts her still. Story 80. Retired. I was a magnet for 911 calls for babies. I took a call for weird sounds from a garbage can in the parking lot of a fast food restaurant. I had the caller put the phone up to the garbage can so I could hear the sounds, and I immediately knew it was a baby. Baby survived and was adopted. And another, but not the last of those damn calls. I was 8 months pregnant at the time, and I took a call of a baby found drowned in a pond. The baby wasn't conscious or breathing. I made a mistake transposing the house numbers when dispatching medical aid after taking the initial 911 call, but fortunately, it didn't affect the outcome of the situation, but unfortunately it was because the baby was down for quite some time. I took some time off, then went back for a few years. I really wasn't the same after 15 years of that crap. I've gone to therapy and regained some sensitivity and compassion that tends to leave a person after they've done a job in that career. Story 81. Another one on a lighter note to balance all the previous grim calls. I had a lady call who was sobbing so hard I could barely understand her. I determined it was a medical issue, but she wasn't making much sense through the sobbing. I finally got her to calm down a little so she could relay what the issue was. She said she was at a full-serve gas station, I didn't even know those existed anymore where I live, and the attendant had pumped too much gas into her car. She had only asked for $20 and they had filled her tank. Then she breaks down sobbing again. I ask her if the attendant is being rude or if they were threatening her, because I still couldn't figure out what the crying was about. She said no, the attendant apologized and gave her a receipt for the gas. I said, okay, what's the issue? She burst into tears again and said that she was afraid they would chase her down if she tried to leave and say that she stole the gas. I went over what the attendant said to her again, that clearly the attendant acknowledged it was a mistake, so she was free to leave. She was still sobbing when I said I had to let her go because this isn't a matter for 911. The very next call I get comes in on the non-emergency line, and it's the attendant from the gas station. She's super worried about the lady having a meltdown over getting at least $20 in free gas. She's pretty sure the lady's unfit to drive due to all the tears. The attendant was just as baffled as I was over the lady's reaction to free gas. If I had to guess, I would say that woman's been through a day or a time or something. That is not a normal measured reaction to a situation, meaning some other factors were at play. So whatever it was, I hope it got all sorted out for her. Definitely a wild call to get as an operator though. Story 82. So this is sort of different from what the question is asking, but it's something I won't ever forget. There was a terrible accident outside of my neighborhood. It happens all the time. The turn is horrible. And as I was in the car driving around the accident, I saw them lift up a car, and then all of the paramedics kind of jump back or open their mouths in shock. Didn't understand what was going on until later. My friend's dad is a cop and responded to that call of the accident. I asked my friend if he knew anything about what happened, and he did, and I kind of wish he didn't. The people involved in the accident were a motorcyclist and a person in a car. The motorcyclist somehow fell off his bike, and a car, in an attempt to avoid him, tried to swerve, but somehow ended up flipping his car on top of the guy on the ground. So the motorcyclist with the car on top of his legs was somehow conscious and able to talk to the paramedics. Apparently he said something about feeling like he had broken ribs, but he couldn't feel his legs. So they lifted the car off him and he apparently just fell apart. The car was holding his crushed body together, but as soon as they lifted it up, his insides came out of him and he just died immediately. I am very glad I didn't witness it. Story 83. It was one of my first calls. Had a young girl call to say she was about to run away because she was being encouraged into an arranged marriage, and she felt she couldn't say no to her family. She asked that when she runs away, we don't look for her no matter who calls to say that she's missing. It stumped me, because no matter how much training you go through or role plays you enact, you can never fully be prepared for what may come, and this was a scenario I hadn't even thought about before. Managed to calm the girl down and go over the differences between an arranged marriage and a forced marriage, the latter being illegal with protections available. Everyone should have the right to choose who to marry or when/if to marry. I had to explain that we can't ignore a report of missing persons, but then made her aware of the various support available to her and the charities that specialize with similar circumstances, so she didn't feel like she had to go through this alone. That there's a middle ground between running away and dealing with her family. I really felt like I could have done more for the girl, and haven't been able to shake that feeling since. Story 84. The one that stands out the most was my first and thankfully only shots fired call. December of 2017, right before Christmas. I sent a few officers to a QA, questionable activity, basically the catch-all for anything suspicious but undefined, with basically no information. All we had was a woman screaming about someone trying to take her child and a lot of noise. The call taker was trying her hardest to get anything out of this lady, but she was understandably upset and couldn't focus on answering questions. 4 minutes after the officers arrived on scene, one of them keys up screaming, "Shots fired! Shots fired! Man down, I need aid here immediately! Shots fired!" He probably spoke for less than 10 seconds, but that was the longest 10 seconds of my life. I can't begin to explain to people the chills I feel when I think or talk about this call, how awful the officer's voice sounded, and the fear I felt. It is a sound unlike any other that only someone who has been through it too can understand. It was like my heart simultaneously stopped and was going 1,000 beats a minute. One of the really hard things about dispatch is that you rarely get to know what happened. You send out the call, do what you need to do, and then you go on to the next one. About a month after that day, one of the sergeants asked me to sit down and debrief. What happened was that this woman, the caller, was out walking in the neighborhood with her family when this guy came up and tried to grab her child. The caller's husband and father got into a fight with this guy, who was eventually dragged back by his wife back to their own house nearby. As the officers arrived and started investigating, the guy loaded up with an assault rifle, a handgun, and a few hundred rounds of ammo. As he exited his house, one of the officers saw him, screamed at him to drop his weapons, and as the guy raised his rifle and aimed at the officer fired off live shots. The man died on scene, despite the officers' and firefighters' efforts. The officer was deemed justified in the subsequent investigation, and according to the state, if not for his actions, we would have been dealing with a mass shooting. I don't often think of that day. It doesn't keep me up at night or give me nightmares, but occasionally something reminds me of it, and I get goosebumps remembering that officer's voice ringing in my ears. I'm not exactly a 911 operator. However, I do work as a controller at a 24/7 command and control facility on an Air Force base in the southwestern part of the country. My favorite call is from a guy we hear from pretty regularly, once every couple of weeks or so, going on several years. Guy is absolutely nuts, completely out of touch with reality. Kind of person calling saying they're government agents or they saw an alien or what have you. About a year ago, he called giving us his normal routine, announces himself as whatever he thinks he is today, rambles for about 10 minutes to inform us of critical information, thanks us for our time, and hangs up. This time he wanted to make sure we knew he had created life in his living area. He said he was sitting on the couch when from nothing spawned a floating 4-foot-long creature he described as having wings, body, and legs of a dragonfly, the tail of a scorpion, and the head of a hammerhead shark. He is a strange guy. Of course, we get plenty of calls about aircraft damage, injuries, and airmen being offed, but we try not to commit that stuff to memory for obvious reasons. I don't think I'll forget that guy, though. I might even miss him when I leave. Story 86. Actual 911 dispatcher here. I have multiple calls that I've tucked away in the back of my head. Some of the ones that stand out are the ones where people report their loved ones as not awake or not breathing. Now, our job is to render aid if we can, essentially before the actual help gets there. So after they report their child, sibling, parent, or spouse isn't breathing, it's normal to start giving CPR instructions. The calls that I remember are the ones where nobody wants to do CPR. They're in disbelief. They use the sound of incoming sirens as a safety blanket and refuse to do anything. And other dispatchers can relate. You try every technique in the book to try to convince them to start, and they will not budge. The ones who cry the whole time are the worst. And then you feel awful when the crews get to the scene and pronounce the patient. And you, as the dispatcher, start playing the what-ifs in your head. But alas, it's on to the next call. Story 87. Listening to a husband watch his wife die in front of him, whilst his ambulance was off chasing a hoax call. I'm a 999 call handler for the ambulance service in the UK, so only deal with medical calls. I took a call from a man whose wife, mid-60s, had collapsed in the bathroom. She was still conscious and breathing, but was doing really poorly. Something seemed off, so I stayed on the line. This was coded as a call requiring an emergency response, but not the top priority. So when my colleague next to me took a call for top priority about 10 miles away from my address, the crew who had been driving to mine got reassigned to that job. I got another ambulance assigned pretty quickly, but it was further away, adding 15 minutes to the wait. Throughout the call, the husband, an ex-policeman, was crying and begging me to hurry, asking for information on where they were that he knew I couldn't give. When the crew were mere minutes away, he suddenly stopped and said, "Oh God, she's gone." And I heard the phone clatter to the ground as he rushed to her. I tried to call out to him to find out what was happening, knowing that I was about to have to tell him to do CPR, but he didn't come back. It was the longest 2 minutes of my life waiting to hear the sound of the crew rushing in. They attempted resuscitation, but she didn't make it. Had the original ambulance not been diverted, they would have been there before she arrested. As it was, they were trying to locate a female who had been kidnapped, who was supposedly being assaulted, stabbed, injected with drugs, etc. All a complete fabrication, courtesy of a scorned ex-boyfriend. To add to this, my colleague next to me taking this call knew it was a hoax, but we cannot judge the integrity of the caller and had to take it seriously. Some pissed-off ex-boyfriend thought wasting an ambulance was all fun and games, while a man watched his life partner die in front of him. I cried so much, with anger, sadness, and frustration. I know there's nothing I can do, but I still feel like I failed that man. We advised the police of what happened, but I doubt anything will come of it. I just hope that man can carry on his life and doesn't blame me for what happened. Story 88. Got a 911 call from a hysterical 13-year-old girl saying someone was in her house trying to hurt her and her mom. Mom grabs the phone from her and tells me her husband has been shot and is dying. She took herself and her son and daughter upstairs and locked themselves in a bedroom. I was able to get the address, the name of the suspect, their neighbor, and a basic description. Male, white, gray sweatshirt. I ask if he came on foot or in a vehicle and I don't get any response. I'm left with an open line. I start hearing slamming and shrieking followed by gunshots, which aren't as loud as you would think over the phone, more shrieks of terror, and then silence. The suspect had kicked in the door and shot the mother, her 8-year-old son, and also shot the 13-year-old daughter through her hands and into her face. But she was the only one who survived. Officers pulled up right as he was shooting them and immediately put out a call of officers in trouble. The suspect ran out of the house with the gun, and the officers opened fire on him. Suspect died at the hospital about 2 hours later. The call went as well as it possibly could have gone. It was less than 1 minute in the time from when the call started to the open line, and I was able to get absolute critical details through her panic. The first unit on scene was quite literally right around the corner from the house when the shooting call was put out. Story 89. I work as an EMT in the ER and on an ambulance. There have been a lot of calls that will always stay with me, but the one that really sticks out was from a few months ago. EMS is dispatched to a possible drowning. When they get there, it turns out it's a 18-month-old boy who drowned in the bathtub because grandma fell asleep while she was watching her 3 grandchildren, 7, 5, and 18 months. The 7-year-old decided to give the other 2 a bath. By the time the little boy rolls through the ER bay doors, he's blue, wet, and cold. His initial body temp at the start of hospital CPR was 84 degrees Fahrenheit. He's been down approximately an hour before EMS gets there, and he was down another hour while we worked him in the ER, so he was down a total of 2 hours approximately. During CPR, the mother burst in the room, screaming, crying, and every single one of us were already on the verge of losing it. So when that happens, we're all running this code in tears. On the final pulse check, right before the doctor was going to call it, we get a pulse, and it's a strong one. The look of shock on the doctor's and everyone else's faces was priceless. No one expected a positive outcome. The kid survived, although with an anoxic brain injury because of being down without oxygen for so long, but survived nonetheless. I'm convinced his low body temp and the particular doctor that took the code that day is the only reason he survived. I'm not sure what his quality of life will be going forward, but I've kept tabs on him since that day, and even though he has the brain injury, the doctors say he's exceeding their expectations daily, even with it. Story 90. During a class for dispatch, we had to listen to a few calls that covered a few scenarios. I was only 3 months into the job at that point, but the recording still plays in my head. We got on the subject of domestic abuse. It's a little boy who has dialed 911, while you can hear his mother and brother screaming in the background. I remember hearing "please don't off my mom, please," over and over again, while the boyfriend just calmly said, "I have to." You hear a couple shots and the mother goes quiet, and then a few more. For the next 30 seconds or so, you hear the last moans and sobs from this little kid as he is dying on the floor. Then complete silence. That messed me right up. I went to dinner that night with my boyfriend at the time and panicked when I heard a child crying 2 tables down from us. Even though it messed me up and still gives me shivers to think about, I could never imagine doing anything else. I count myself as extremely lucky that I've yet to take on a call of that level, even though I know it's coming one day. I definitely think it's important to play those sorts of calls in training, but if that isn't just the roughest introduction to a job you can have. But yeah, that's the job, huh? A worst case scenario, but it can happen, and clearly does. You hear stuff like this and hey, it's no wonder operators and such have to get detached from their empathy a little bit. As was mentioned earlier in this thread, if you take every call and you internalize it, you process it, you think about it, you just couldn't handle it. It's simply too much. Story 91. I was a dispatcher for about 4 years in a rural county. The worst call I got was a hunting accident. A guy took his 6-year-old son out hunting with him and gave the kid a loaded rifle to carry. The kid, while trying to get through tamarack bushes, grabbed the weapon by the barrel and dragged it behind him. The weapon got caught on a branch and discharged into the kid's head. The father called 911, got me, and didn't know where he was at, as he wasn't familiar with the area and it wasn't his land. All he could tell me was that they passed a lake or pond on a dirt road. There are several dirt roads with ponds, and I was able to narrow it down to 6 roads with the location data from the cell towers. This was early 2000s and triangulation in rural areas sucked. Not sure how much better it is now. I dispatched every deputy I had on call, all 2 of them, the 1 city cop I had on duty, and both our ambulances and fire to the area. State Patrol also assisted with the search. It took us over 20 minutes to find them, and the whole time the father wept uncontrollably, screaming, "Please don't be dead," over and over again, while I gave instructions from the flip chart to check his vitals, try to stop the bleeding, etc. My instructions only lasted about 5 minutes, and I'd given him all the info I was trained to give. The remaining 15 felt like an eternity, and from what the father told me and what I was told by the deputies after, he was pretty much dead immediately after the incident. The EMTs still went through with their routines and loaded the kid in the ambulance because none of them felt comfortable doing otherwise in the situation. This was my first shift back after the birth of my son, so I think that's why it sticks with me. Story 92. I was recently released from training and I got a call that someone fell out a window and onto a wrought iron fence. Then I got a call from someone else that her boyfriend was high on PCP and tried to fly. Needless to say, he didn't survive. He made it all the way to the ER ambulance bay with a section of fence impaling him and then went into cardiac arrest. Second one I remember is a call for a bad motorcycle accident on the highway. The first call I got, the guy said the bike just rammed full speed into the back of a box truck and exploded into flames. Got a whole bunch of calls describing the bodies as being strewn over the road. The first officers on scene instantly said we had 2 DOAs. The woman was burned beyond recognition, and the man's entire face was gone, ripped away from crashing and sliding on the roadway. The bike was so burned that they couldn't run the plates or the VIN. Their wallets burned, so they had no ID to look at. There was a bag, all of the contents spilled over the roadway, and it was filled with baby supplies. Turns out the woman was on a quick run to fetch supplies for her baby and never made it back. The officers managed to identify the victims because family members were nearby and heard of the accident and knew they had gone out just a short while beforehand. Story 93. Some sad ones. A 4-year-old girl with a tracheostomy tube wasn't breathing. The little girl had a nurse who was performing CPR. I was on the phone with her brother and I could hear the mom in the background literally growling that they better freaking hurry. I've read in books about people growling as they speak, but I've never heard it before then. A 17-year-old boy hanged himself. His parents found him. I was on the phone with his mother and telling her to tell her husband how to do CPR. He didn't make it. I stopped by my dad's house after my shift and cried in his arms. It's making me tear up writing it. A man in his mid-70s called for general illness. He was really upset, so I stayed on the phone. He told me he had cancer and he's been going downhill. Then he started crying and told me he didn't want to die yet. I wanted so badly to visit him in the hospital, but I would have gotten in a lot of trouble. Now, some make you feel good. A girl called that her friend was ODing on H. She said her lips were blue. The caller was really upset and hardly listening, but I finally got her to calm down so we could help her friend. We started doing CPR, and after a minute, she said the color was coming back to her lips. Her friend made it to the hospital alive. That was a really good feeling. An elderly woman was having a hard time breathing. She was stable, so I wasn't required to stay on the phone. I was telling her I was going to let her go, and she asked if I was going to hang up with her. I told her I could stay on the line if she wanted me to, and she said she did. She told me that medical problems are the scariest part of living alone, and I told her, "You're not alone. I'm right here with you." She asked me my name, so I told her, and then she gave me hers. Then she said she wished we were meeting under different circumstances, like at a Publix or something. She was really sweet. It's crazy feeling a genuine connection with someone you'll never meet, and some funny ones. A very concerned father said his 17-year-old daughter was in a puddle of blood. I asked what happened. She woke up from a nap and was bleeding, quote, from her privates. He called 911 for his daughter's period. A woman called because her bird had accidentally tangled a piece of thread from his toy around his neck. Fortunately, she got it off before the fire department even showed. A man calls regularly, reporting all sorts of symptoms, trying to figure out how to get the fire department to respond because he thinks they're cute. A woman reported she needed animal services because her neighbor had a dog tied up to a tree in their backyard, and she brought it inside because she was afraid he was going to overheat and die. It was about 60 degrees outside, and she was allergic to dogs. And my all-time favorite. A woman changed the password on her phone but couldn't remember what it was. She wanted me to walk her through a factory reset on her phone because she was babysitting and had no way to call someone in an emergency, even though she just called 911. I told her I can't help with that. Calls back an hour later and I told her no again. She says, "Fine, then this kid's probably gonna die," and hangs up. Call her back and ask for her address. She asks if someone is coming out to help reset her phone. I said, "No, they're coming because you said this child is going to die." She told me I'm wasting government time and resources. Story 94. It's been years now, but I worked for a private ambulance service that the 911 dispatch routed calls to so we could prioritize and send the ambulance. We were busy enough where there should have been 2 of us, but there rarely was. Calm night, 1 truck on a non-emergency call, and then all hell broke loose. Got a direct call for someone who had ideations. They had a gun and was planning to use it, so I need to get people en route, including police, to protect my crews. And the floodgates opened. I took 9 emergency calls in the next 4 minutes and at one point had 3 active phones. Guy with the gun sat on my counter, an emergency call in each hand, and just telling crews the location and whether it was lights and sirens or not. When I picked up the phone on the counter, the guy wasn't there anymore. After this, I got a second person full-time, but I'm still wondering if it would have made a difference that night. On a more positive note, we got to attend an awards ceremony when my partner and I talked a set of parents through CPR that actually worked and met those parents. That was a nice moment. Story 95. I worked in Houston and I feel like I have too many calls that I'll never forget. A woman standing in front of her husband as he held their child with his knife to it, threatening to off the baby right in front of her. A mom who heard a gunshot and found her teenage son had been playing Russian roulette in the garage with his friends. A mom's wails as she found her 2-year-old face down in a kiddie pool. That's a sound you don't forget. A woman being followed. I'm directing her to a substation where an officer's waiting. She stopped at a light. The follower ran up and shot her in the head. It was her jealous ex. A daughter waiting on her mom to get up on a weekend morning to help her with homework. Mom wasn't getting up and the door was locked. Mom and boyfriend found dead on the other side of that door in a case of murder and then someone taking their own lives. I worked a night shift when all the good stuff happens. That last call, though, haunted me. I quit working there when a call came from my own house, and my daughter died. OP, I hope that you have an incredible support system, which hopefully includes therapy. Even out of all of the threads in here, it sounds like you've been through a lot. And that's saying the least I can, really. And I've said it before, but I know it doesn't mean anything, but really my heart goes out to you, OP. It sounds like a lot of aspects of life haven't been very kind to you. And I hope it only gets better from here. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry. Story 96. It was around Valentine's Day. We received a call from a business in our town that said they had a young child, 2 to 4, on the line and weren't able to transfer them to us. The kid said something about their parents and how they weren't waking up. The business was fortunately able to get the number off their caller ID. While we were waiting to receive our first pings from the cell phone company, I took the number and worked my magic. I've got multiple ways where I can find all kinds of stuff off a phone number, including names and addresses. I found a possible address that was 2 cities away from us. I cross-referenced the name with voter records and came up with the same address. I began to send a terminal message to that agency to start a welfare check. About when I did that, we got the first ping. The ping was garbage. Instead of being down to several meters, it gave us the distance of 5 miles within the tower, which normally you wouldn't be able to do a lot with. But that 5-mile radius contained the address I found that was in that city. I sent the ping info to that agency. They got there and found the child. It was a murder and taking of one's own life of the parents, and was like a scene from Dexter in the bloody container. The child was safe and unharmed, at least. Story 97. Honestly, the hardest ones aren't the shootings or the terrible accidents or things like that. We're typically only on the line with those people for 90 seconds. It's easier to compartmentalize. When we're doing CPR, it takes longer, but we're focused on a task the whole time. Same thing with home invasions. We're trying to gather intelligence and help the caller find a safe exit or shelter. It's totally task-focused. The hardest calls are people who might take their own lives. There's some basic info gathering we have to do, but after that, our job is to keep them talking, and that invariably means making some form of connection. It's a little different than hotlines because we handle the cases where they have a specific plan or means to off themselves. They're the ones that stick with you because there's no pro QA or script you can pass the blame off to if you fail. You're just left asking, and maybe if I'd asked them different questions or phrased things in a different way. There's one in particular that stuck with me. I think about him all the time. Mike was a successful local businessman, and he was caught in an escort sting around 2 years before I first talked to him. His story was published in the local papers. All his clients left him, his wife divorced him. When I talked to him, he was living out of a motel because he lost his home, and he was having a hard time finding an apartment because he was now a registered offender without a stable income. He was 53 and didn't really have any hope of starting a new career. He was a gentle guy, super articulate. I just remember him asking me what he had left to live for. He asked, honestly, if you were in my shoes, would you want to keep going? And all I could give him was platitudes because, honestly, my answer would have been no. I talked to Mike 3 times over the course of about a month. No idea if he did it or not, but I still think about him all the time. Doesn't help that he was exactly the same age my dad was when he died, and even kind of sounded like him. Story 98. A few will stick with me forever. The most heart-wrenching one was an elderly man who called 911 and said he needed an ambulance. He calmly gave his address, then said he had shot his wife, and that he would be in the backyard when help arrived. I tried to get more information from him, but he just hung up. The ambulance got there and found him and his wife dead in the backyard. Turns out she had a terminal illness and didn't want to suffer anymore. She asked him to shoot her. He couldn't live without her or the decision they made, so he took his own life. On a happier note, one call I'll never forget was a mother in labor. It was a healthy, normal pregnancy. I helped Dad coach Mom through the labor, and then eventually coached Dad through delivering his own child. I can still hear that first cry like it happened yesterday. As soon as the baby cried out, the ambulance crew walked through their front door. Dad was crying and thanking me for helping. All I could say was, "Congratulations, you're so very welcome." Also, on a somewhat happy note, this call is the one I'm most proud of. I had a mom call 911 for her teenage son because he wasn't breathing. He had some sort of rare vocal cord dysfunction where the vocal cords tightened so much he couldn't take a breath in. 911 dispatchers have guide cards to help with common ailments. The card for someone who isn't breathing instructs you to give CPR. The boy was still conscious, but he just couldn't take in a breath. So CPR would have been pointless, and just giving rescue breaths would have possibly torn his vocal cords, or more likely, would have been completely ineffective. I had to think back to my voice lessons as a child. Raising the chin lengthens the vocal cords. I told Mom to have the boy raise his chin, and he raised his chin, and I heard a huge gasp of air. It worked. Then the mom said excitedly, "He took a breath. Oh my God, he took a breath. But now he can't exhale." Well, if raising the chin lengthens the cords, then lowering it must loosen them, right? So I told her to have him lower his chin to his chest. By some miracle, that worked too. We did this chin raising and lowering thing until the ambulance arrived, and they could get him to a bariatric chamber for treatment. Story 99. I was only a dispatcher for a year and a half, but I have a ton of stories. Even though these were 6 to 7 years ago, I think about them every day. There are moments that I break down a bit and think of the agony these people must have gone through. It's really hard to be on the other side of a phone when someone desperately needs your help. Dispatchers go through some really tough training to be there. You always hear the bad things about them on the news, but you never hear the millions of great things they do every single day. If you know a dispatcher, thank them. They're highly trained, overworked, and underpaid. Now to my stories. Some backstory: not only did we answer calls in our center, but we also worked at the radio for units. Some centers are split. We rotated different radios every night, as we were in charge of 3 localities. On the job 1. So my whole shift won a regional teamwork award for this call. I didn't take the original call, but a center policy is to have at least one other person listening to emergency calls for backup. A coworker answers the call and gets a no response. We hear some rustling and then some screaming, then silence. Coworker keeps trying to ask for information. As we can tell something is wrong, we start to hear a male voice saying some raw things. Stuff like, "Suck it," and "Eat it," N-word. Something is really wrong. We start to hear this woman crying as she's obviously being forced to do things to this guy. We hear him hitting her, more verbal abuse, and SA. We hear it all. The problem is we can't tell where she is. She had most likely called in on a prepaid phone, so there's no caller information coming in, and we can only see the nearest cell tower she's pinging off of. We go ahead and get a deputy in the area and advise them we're trying to locate her, but we have no information. The SA goes on and off. You can hear the guy finish, then go watch TV while the woman cries, and then he comes back, says the same horrible things, hits her, and then it all happens again. He must have done it at least 4 times. This went on for 45 minutes, until during one of the essays, the woman says a name begging them to stop. Finally, we get some information. We start searching all of our records in that area for this name. We advise the deputy, and amazingly, another deputy comes on and says, "That name sounds familiar. I had a domestic in that area involving that name a few days ago." We start searching all of our past calls and find one matching the name. We advise the deputies in the area, and they go start checking apartments. After a few attempts, the deputy knocks on this one apartment, and we actually hear him knocking. We go wild, screaming, "That was it, that was it." The deputy breaks in, and we hear the whole thing. Dude gets arrested, and woman goes to hospital. It was one of the hardest things I've ever had to listen to. I have tears right now writing this. I go out for my break and call my girlfriend and tell her I just had a rough call. As I'm outside, the deputy pulls around the back with the guy, and they take him into interrogation. Dude was short and funny looking, and I was mad, but I knew he had what was coming to him. On the job, too. This night I was working the hardest radio, which was one of the larger localities' sheriffs. Around 2 a.m. I took the 911 call from some lady who thinks she heard what sounded like a car accident near her house. I take what information I can get and send out police/rescue to investigate. Around the same time, another call comes in that someone else answers. It's this guy who just keeps saying, "I can't find my friend." He pings near the area of my call, so we start thinking it's related. The other call taker is trying to get info from him, but as soon as one of my deputies arrives, he states 1 DOA. Okay, things just got real. We start dispatching more rescue to the scene. More deputies arrive, and they apparently search the scene for another person. A few moments go by, and they radio in another DOA. I was feeling horrible. So as they processed the scene and found the guy that called us, he happened to be a passenger in this vehicle that wrecked. Now listen to this. These were some young Navy guys that had left the bar in a taxi, got home, and then decided to drive to a Taco Bell. They were speeding in this one guy's new Camaro, lost control and hit a tree. Driver was ejected into a tree, splattered. The front passenger was the caller, dazed but nothing more than a scratch. The rear passenger was our first DOA. I happened to see a picture of the accident, and he was still sitting in the back seat with a beam from the trunk through his torso slumped over. The only thing left of the car was the back seat and part of the trunk. Everything else was obliterated. I can't believe that one guy survived. He's lucky, but I'm sure he has some issues about his friends now. At my current job, I almost drive past this spot every day, and I see the little cross on the side of the road for the driver. On the job 3. This was my first day answering emergency calls. I was in full control and had to take my training into account and save some lives. It wasn't 30 minutes into my 12-hour shift when I got my first call. I'm thinking, all right, here we go, please be easy. Nope. Woman screaming bloody murder. I'm like, okay, training kicks in. I try to get her to calm down. Tell me where you are. What's going on? I get the basics and drop the call. Dropping means sending my information so the dispatcher working the correct area units can be sent, but I can still add additional information. The woman who is hysterical states her husband is trying to offer and he has a gun. I'm trying to run through my training and let her know we have deputies coming and to stay in a safe place, locked up if possible. No. She runs outside because her mom lives next door and she wants to go there. So now she's running in a field with her husband chasing her with a gun. She gets inside her mom's house and closes the door, but I guess the dude was right behind her. I can hear him yelling to open the door, and I actually hear him banging on the door with the gun. I was freaking out. What could I do? I try to keep her calm, get her away from the door, find a bathroom maybe, or a place with no windows she can lock herself in. Oh, and where's your mother? Get her in a safe place too. Luckily, deputies respond fast with threat of a gun, and within minutes they were on the scene and had the guy in custody. The guy really wasn't trying to offer because he had plenty of opportunities. My first call was a wreck, but they said I did just about everything I could have. It could have gone many different ways, so I'm glad it was like this. Gives me a little comedy relief compared to my others. Like, of course, this was my first real emergency call. Couldn't have been the old person asking for directions. On the job 4. This wasn't necessarily ours. When nights are slow, we have regional radios turned up, because it isn't uncommon for next-door localities to ask for help. We're listening to our sister center and hear the call go out for structure fire with possible occupants. We're on standby in case they need additional. A few moments later, we hear one of the deputies arrive on scene giving the rundown. 2-story house fully involved. Children inside. Our hearts sank. We can hear this deputy by himself giving updates as he's trying to get inside. We can hear his voice in agony as he's getting burned trying to find these kids. He ends up leaving the house and advises he can't find anyone. You can hear how heavy his heart is. He tried his best, but it wasn't enough. 3 kids died in the fire. One was an infant that our own deputy delivered in a parking lot 3 months prior. God, that was tough. It's not fair. On the job 5. This was my last week working in my center. I was working one of my favorite radios. Call came in as a vehicle versus bicycle. Not a great call. I sent out rescue. One of our deputies happened to be a few cars behind the accident, so he is first on scene. Deputy advises that PT is unconscious and not breathing. He attempts to do CPR but stops because as he compressed, the chest blood started gushing from his face. Rescue gets on scene, takes him to hospital where he's declared deceased. Not the most intense call, but it just stuck with me. This was not that old of a guy riding his bike, making a simple mistake, and he's dead. If anything, it makes me realize always be cautious of your surroundings. On the job 6. I debated adding this one. It's more funny, and to get everyone reading this out of a depressed mood. Call comes in. A group of men who are camping out in a parking lot for a reenactment state there's a girl walking around and pulling on their truck handles. They state she seems intoxicated. We keep them on the line to get extra information. Eventually, she finds a door handle that opens and climbs inside the truck. The guys are laughing but don't want to go stop her when all of a sudden, one of the guys realizes his keys are in the truck, and at the same moment the truck starts up. Now the drunk girl has a truck. She takes off, jumps a few curbs, and leaves the parking lot. We can hear the guys joking on their buddy whose truck it was, and then he realizes, oh, my loaded gun is in there. So now we have a possible intoxicated college student driving a stolen vehicle with a gun. Officers start searching the area and one stumbles across a truck in a ditch that matches the description. He searches the truck and doesn't find anyone. Another officer in the area finds a girl walking down the road. He stops and begins questioning her. We can hear her when his mic opens and you can tell she's drunk. They ask her some questions that she claims she has no idea what they're talking about, but is more concerned why her cell phone doesn't work. The officer looks at it and realizes she's holding a GPS unit. The officer searches the truck and finds her cell phone, but she still claims she had nothing to do with it. So they take the GPS, click on the home shortcut, which goes to the address that the truck is registered to. Oops. Girl is arrested for a whole bag of charges. Crazy thing is, she was a local student at a prestigious law school, set to graduate in a month. School has a strict zero-tolerance policy, and hey, all that hard work, and she screwed herself. I hope you enjoyed my stories. I hope you learned something. I also hope if you know a dispatcher, you thank them and listen to them. Talking about my experiences has helped me. Some of these things haunt me today. I had really bad stress working there, and the effects of that are strenuous. OP came in here with a full 200-page essay. Not really, it was like 2 pages, but still. For Reddit comment, that's a lot. OP sounds like they did some great work as a dispatcher, and they handled a lot of tough calls, as I'm sure many do. I'm glad they decided to end it on a lighter one, because that's also our last story of the day. This, aside from being a long video, was also a really heavy thread in general. So if you somehow trudged through it all in one go, I beg you, decompress. Take some time away from the video, maybe even away from your computer or whatever, and just chill for a bit. That was a lot. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day or night wherever you are, and I will see you in the next one.